A Duchess for the Duke. A Clairvoir Castle novella. Written by Sally Britton. Narrated by Jessica Elisa Boyd. Chapter 1. May 1791. The quiet crackle of the fire in the library's hearth was the only sound aside from the scratching of Gregory's quill. Even in London, most of the world slept at this late hour, except for him. The weight of the mantle he wore, the lists of all he must see to in a given day kept him from finding rest. He existed alone in the silence with his thoughts. Until his mother strode into the room without so much as a knock on the door. She had reminded him only recently that duchesses did not knock in their own homes. Perhaps he should employ a servant to do so for her. "I must speak with you before you find yet another reason to delay my chosen topic." The Duchess clutched at her black lace handkerchief, her head held at a regal angle. She hadn't entirely put off her black mourning for the late Duke, even a year after his death. Gregory Dinard, the current Duke of Montfort, dropped his pen on the blotter and rose to his feet. "Mother." He came around his desk and gestured to a chair near the fire. "Come, sit down. I thought you had gone to bed." "I had." She glided through the room toward him, as beautiful at 43 as she had been the day her wedding portrait to the 4th Duke of Montfort, Gregory's father, had been commissioned. Yet no sooner did my head touch my pillow than I realized this moment is the perfect opportunity to have this conversation with you. Out of respect for your father, and all you have had to learn and adjust as you have filled his role, I have remained silent. Now here we are, a year and a month since his death. It is time for you to move forward, Montfort. His insides chilled when she addressed him by his father's title. It still did not suit him. He shuddered, then tried to cover the response by turning away from her. The topic she wished to address held no mystery for him. She wanted him to find a wife. She'd been hinting at it for weeks. Better to put her off again. "That is precisely what I have worked toward, Mother." He gestured to the desk he had vacated a moment before. "I have taken my place in the House of Lords." And how he hated that no one took him seriously. At only 24, everyone saw him as too young and idealistic, despite his passionate nature. Even if he was one of the most powerful men in the room, and even though their current Prime Minister had taken on his role at the same age. "All our affairs are in order. The ducal lands are solvent." He let his gaze wander to the fireplace, its black stone reflecting the heat into the otherwise cold room. A room he had tried and failed to feel comfortable within every time he sat down to work. She tutted, bringing his gaze back to her. The Duchess wrapped her black shawl more snugly around her shoulders. "More than solvent. You are one of the wealthiest men in England." Gregory spread his hands palm up. "What more would you have me accomplish, Mother?" She tipped her chin up, a stubborn chin she had passed on to her son and 2 daughters. "Marry. I beg your pardon. A duke should beg no one's pardon." "Mother." Gregory resisted the urge to tug at his hair, a habit he had given up when he'd entered the Lords. He'd powdered his hair rather than wear a wig that would make him itch all the day long. Now he rather wished to reverse that decision. Now is not the time to bring a new duchess into the family. He knew well enough that the woman his parents had intended for him was, well, not a woman yet. They had informed their son he would wed when he reached 30, and his father had pointed out a friend's daughter as the bride. A daughter who would be 18 when Gregory reached 30, and she certainly wasn't ready for marriage now. He never worked out how to refuse his father's demands before the Duke had died, making it a moot point. Since taking on the role of Duke himself, he'd given no thought to marriage. A duchess required as much grooming as a duke, except they usually had less time to train for the position. Gregory had prepared his whole life, and he still felt lost. "It's the perfect time," his mother countered, speaking with all the authority her role allowed. "You may help one another to learn your duties, and I am still here to assist. If your father's passing proved anything to us, it is that people can be taken from this life in an unexpected instant." His father had been a robust gentleman of 57, hardly young, yet he hadn't been ill a day in his life, and then one morning he did not wake up. At least he had died in his sleep instead of with a wasting disease. He never would have stood for growing slowly weaker. Not a man like the late Duke, as full of thunder as a hurricane. Gregory did not bother concealing his exhaustion from his mother. At 2:30 in the morning, she had to be as tired as him. "I am certain you have all manner of arguments for your point, Your Grace. Must we discuss them tonight?" "No. I will continue to make my point tomorrow. Tonight, I wish you to consider the candidate I have in mind for you." He was too tired to be surprised she had already chosen her ideal future daughter-in-law. To be sure she and he were of a mind on at least one thing, he said. "Not Lady Charlotte, I hope." "That child?" She sounded scandalized. "I am relieved we feel the same about that." "She was your father's choice, not mine. Some foolish idea he had with that Prussian friend of his." She snorted. "No, you need someone nearer your age. The world will thrust her into the role as you were into yours. We need a woman of maturity, in spirit if not in body." That sounded rather dull to him, but less alarming than the alternative. "Whom do you have in mind?" "Lady Cecilia Boxbury." The name conjured a vague memory of a dark-haired woman with deep blue eyes. He remembered the words she had spoken to him better than he remembered her appearance, though her eyes stood out in his memory, given the unusual hue. He tried to sketch in the missing details of her features and failed. Where had they met? At dinner, perhaps? Everything he'd done in the past year outside of Lord's and his private office was a blur. Social engagements that did not further political ambitions were easily forgotten. Except what she had said to him that night. The way she had spoken about his father's loss had given him pause. "The Earl of Cromer's daughter?" he asked at last. "Of course." The Duchess rose to her feet without warning, and he hastily did the same. "She is a perfect candidate. Her mother is the daughter of an Austrian princess, you know." "Is she?" A distant relative to royalty would suit most members of the nobility, but as a duke, he could likely marry a princess in her own right. "I am surprised you are not considering the children and grandchildren of the crown heads of Europe." "Do not be ridiculous," she sniffed. "If the Americans and French have taught us anything, it is that we cannot trust foreign alliances for our future. It is best to look at home for what we need, whether it is British goods or British wives." Gregory nearly chuckled, but doubted his mother would appreciate any humour he found in a statement she made with such sobriety. "Let me escort you to your chambers, mother." "Thank you." She took his arm and he led them from the study into the darkened house. A few servants were awake, stationed at the end of corridors in case the family had need of them. They were sentries as much as they were footmen, too. The men were able-bodied former members of the British Navy, used to following orders to the letter. Dukes were not untouchable by virtue of their titles alone. His father had employed a personal guard for many years. More than once the family had been grateful for that. Best to think on more pleasant topics so close to seeking his bed. "Lady Cecilia," he murmured as they went down the hall. "How did she catch your eye?" "We both attended Lady Jersey's afternoon lecture. She hosted that Mary Wollstonecraft woman. Now there is someone with radical ideas, especially for one so young." She chuckled. "I am surprised you would allow yourself to be in the same room with her, especially after what she wrote about Marie Antoinette." "I thought to try what you are always encouraging, Montfort. As you put it, I may disagree with someone and still find interest in what they have to say. I thought it would delight your youthful political sensibilities to know your mother keeps such low company." She raised her eyebrows with a superior twist to her lips. "Never mind about Wollstonecraft. Lady Cecilia attended with an older sister. We sat near one another and I heard much of their whispered conversation. People tend to think that women over 40 must be deaf." She sniffed. "I found her interesting, and I made inquiries." Which meant Gregory had to do the same, with his mother's mind set on the woman as a candidate for Duchess. "I will arrange a conversation with her father." "Not yet." The current Duchess released his arm as they had arrived at her door. "You had better form an impression of her first. She is coming tomorrow for tea in the garden. I will inform you when she arrives." She tilted her head, presenting him with her cheek. Too startled to act on more than habit, Gregory kissed his mother's cheek and bid her good night. Then he found himself alone in the corridor of their London house, staring into the dark. He had prepared all his life to become a duke. He'd never stopped to consider how to prepare himself to take a duchess. A wife. Likely a scheming, power-hungry woman unable to see past his title and her own ambition. "God help me," he whispered his plea into the shadows. No one but God could know how ill-prepared he was for his role, because a duke never showed weakness or indecision. He couldn't afford to, not even to his Duchess. He squared off his shoulders. It was up to him to find the right woman for the role. If his mother's favoured lady fit the bill, then Gregory would not dither in his decision. He would make her his Duchess as he did everything else, with surety and purpose. Chapter 2. The distance between Dinard House on Piccadilly Street and her family's address in Grosvenor Square might look minuscule on a map. Indeed, the carriage in which Lady Cecilia Boxbury rode made excellent time in traversing the half-mile between the two, despite the afternoon crowds. Yet, notwithstanding the nearness of one house to the other, they were worlds apart in grandeur. Dinard House was by far the more magnificent of the two. "There are the colonnades you are so fond of," her mother said with a fond tilt to her lips. She pointed through the glass of the carriage. "Every time we drive or walk past this house, I think you say something about them." Cecilia had remarked on the architecture of Dinard House with absolute relish every time, too. She knew its history almost as intimately as if she had sketched the initial drafts for the building herself. At least, that's how well she knew the outside. She had taken to drawing the stately lines put into place in the early part of that century, first by Hugh May and then improved upon by the famous James Gibbs. Brilliant architects. The latter had transformed the old-style house into a Palladian structure, his education in Rome showing in the mathematical precision of the columns and windows of the elegant building. It was beautiful in its uniformity. And yet, had she the plans before her to change the building, she had a rather wistful idea of adding another floor, making for 3 stories instead of 2. Giving the whole structure a more imposing look, perhaps, but also making it stand out as a place of beauty. Her mother chuckled, and Cecilia forced herself to draw the curtains over her daydreams to give attention to her mother's amused smile. "I do wish you would stop thinking about building designs and start planning what you will say to the Duke. It is the Duchess who invited us." Despite that protest, Cecilia's insides twisted. "His Grace has many other things to busy him, I am certain. Dukes do not entertain young ladies of little consequence for tea." Despite knowing this, she had worn her best gown of light blue, with a dark, wide ribbon gathering it in at the waist. "Little consequence?" Her mother drew her head higher. "My mother was a Princess of Augsburg. Your father is an earl, newly styled by the reigning King of England. You have consequence, my dear child, and do not let anyone forget it, especially the Duchess and her bachelor son." Cecilia murmured her agreement as dutifully as any daughter would. Yet in her mind she wondered anew at the invitation to take tea with the Duchess in her gardens. She hadn't spoken to the Duchess more than what politeness demanded at Lady Jersey's sponsored lecture. They were not each other's peers in age or standing. The two of them likely had different views on what the lecturer had to say about women's roles in society, too. Yet somehow she'd attracted a powerful woman's interest and an invitation. The Duke himself knew nothing of Cecilia. She had met him once. They had attended the same dinner shortly after his father's death. He hadn't even met her gaze for more than a surprised second or two after she spoke. He had still been in a haze of grief, she had decided, and after giving him her sympathy, she had moved on. A footman approached their carriage at last. Despite what her mother said, Cecilia knew better than to linger on any thoughts of the handsome young Duke. She was beneath his notice. She reminded herself of this even as she stepped from the carriage into the shadow of his London house. The inside of Dinard House deserved more than the hasty study she managed as the butler showed them through the massive house to the gardens. Her steps lingered while she peered up at intricate stairways and panelled ceilings, but the butler cast her a curious look when she turned a corner several paces behind him. Cecilia smiled and ducked her head slightly, the apology unspoken and somewhat surprising given the way the butler's eyes widened. He led them out a set of large glass doors to the gardens where an elaborate canopy with 3 silken walls waited for them. The Duchess rose from her chair, a delicately carved piece of furniture with a perfectly matched table and 3 other chairs. A rug on the ground protected their slippers from the grass as they took the seats the Duchess offered them. She made a point of sitting Cecilia next to the remaining empty chair. "Lady Cromer, do tell me about your family. You have 2 daughters and 3 sons, I believe?" The Duchess kept the conversation in shallow waters for several minutes, and Cecilia struggled to pay attention. Though her mother tried to draw Cecilia into the conversation, the Duchess did not seem the least bit interested in doing the same. Perhaps her Grace regretted the invitation. Cecilia's eyes wandered to the fountain in the middle of the garden. Everything here was precise, in the older style of gardens that had begun to fade from popularity. The gardeners had trimmed the shrubbery into geometric shapes, the flowers nestled in beds with perfect symmetry between them. Everything was orderly, artificial in shape and arrangement. If she had her way, gardens would look far more natural. Paths would curve and bend. Flowers would mix and mingle with one another, creating as much variety in a single bed as the paints on an artist's palette. Movement outside their three-walled tent drew Cecilia's eye. The cloth blocked the house from view, but the path leading to it was still within her sight. So it was that she saw the Duke coming before his mother or hers did. Dark hair, a brow drawn down in a frown, and a towering height made him appear rather unapproachable. He had a nose that stood out but did not look disproportionate upon his handsome face. An artist would likely enjoy capturing the angle of his chin and the line of his shoulders. He caught her staring, but did not slow in his stride. Cecilia rose before he rounded the side of the tent, which meant her mother came to her feet a moment after. "Your Grace." He bowed to his mother, then nodded to his guests. "Ladies, good afternoon. Please do not stand on my account." He had a deep, musical voice. She hadn't remembered that. "Montfort, join us." His mother motioned to the remaining empty chair next to Cecilia. "You ought to take refreshment after your long hours of work." She smiled benignly at Cecilia's mother. "He is a rising star in politics, you know." The Duke bowed again. "Thank you, Your Grace. Yet, as you said, I have been sitting at a desk for some hours. I would prefer to take a turn about the garden before settling in a chair once more." If his easy denial of the invitation surprised his mother, she barely showed it. Her lips pressed together a moment, and Cecilia had to look away or risk smiling. If the Duchess meant to play matchmaker, her son seemed unwilling to go along with her plans. "However," his Grace continued, "I do not wish to forego the company of our guests. Would you join me, Lady Cecilia?" Her head jerked upward. She immediately berated herself for showing surprise. Ladies did not show any emotion in public. Ladies also never turned away an invitation issued by a duke. "It would be a pleasure." She brought her parasol with her from the tent, opening it before accepting the Duke's arm. A thrilling tingle went through the tips of her fingers where they landed upon his coat sleeve, but she ignored how the feelings swiftly spread elsewhere. Despite her pragmatism, she wasn't immune to his appearance, or the knowledge of who he was. A handsome, eligible bachelor of note. The wide brim of her bonnet, coupled with the parasol on her shoulder, protected her well from the sun, but neither shielded her from his stare as they left their mothers behind. Manners dictated she wait for him to speak on the topic of his choosing, yet he remained uncomfortably silent. Perhaps he had no wish to converse, only the desire to appease his mother by pretending to pay attention to a nobody like her. She needn't be bored to tears because he had nothing to say. If anything, she wanted to put the awkward matter to rest between them. "Your Grace, I have something rather impertinent to say to you." He did not appear the least bit curious. "I cannot imagine what it could be, my lady." He expected flirtation and did not care for it. The bored tone he used gave away as much. She faced forward rather than study him. "My mother thinks that your mother wishes to make a match between us," she said plainly. "I told her, my mother, not yours, how ridiculous that would be. You ought to marry a Spanish princess or a Russian countess, one would think." He stopped their walk and she looked up at him. She even prepared herself for a set-down for speaking of things that were none of her concern. But the Duke stared at her with undisguised bafflement. "You do not wish to be a duchess, I take it?" Relaxing enough to smile, Cecilia shook her head. "I have no objection to holding such a title, though I imagine it is far more work than one would think. But I do object to making someone uncomfortable, so you needn't pretend any interest in me for my sake. I am aware of my station in life and do not conspire to rise above it. I have no expectations of this afternoon beyond enjoying your beautiful gardens, Your Grace." The severe look had gone completely from his face. He stared at her as though he'd never seen a lady before and did not know what to make of her. "You have no objection to being a duchess?" "What woman would? Unless she already outranks a duchess." She shrugged and did not much care that some thought the gesture impolite. "I'm a practical woman, not someone searching for a mercenary match." His lips twitched, and the dark look he'd worn melted away into something far more pleasant, much more suitable for such a handsome face. Despite her self-proclaimed practicality, Cecilia felt her cheeks grow warm. Best to blame the sun, even if it was hiding behind a cloud at the moment. The amusement in the Duke's eyes settled her nerves somewhat. She hadn't offended him. "Practical? I suppose I ought to thank you for informing me of your views on marrying me." Her cheeks blazed hotter, and she peered beyond her parasol to see a large white cloud still covering the afternoon sun. "Bother. I value honesty, Your Grace. It didn't seem honest to let you guide me about your gardens while suspecting me of laying a matrimonial trap." She took a step, and he resumed their walk. The quiet between them did not last long. "Perhaps I should reveal a truth to you too, Lady Cecilia." She should not like the way he said her name. "I am willing to listen to whatever you wish to say, Your Grace." They had reached the far side of the square pathway. She could look across the expanse of green, well-ordered plants and the fountain to see her mother and the Duchess at a distance, watching them. "You said before that you thought I should marry a princess or something of the sort. I take it you think the daughter of an earl beneath a duke in consequence?" "I think most of society would agree with me." She let her eyes roam from the grasses and flowers up to the house again. She nearly released a sigh of contentment. She had always wanted to see Dinard House from this side, but had never dared to venture into the Duke's gardens. "Ah, then here is your truth. My mother does think you a suitable candidate for a duchess, and I find I am beginning to agree with her." Cecilia's parasol slipped from her shoulder to hang limply in her hand as she pulled them both to a stop. "You do not," she gasped out. "Not after a mere 10 minutes in my company. That is absurd, Your Grace." "I wish you would stop ending every sentence with Your Grace. I hardly feel graceful at the moment." One corner of his mouth went upward, revealing a rather sneakily placed dimple in his cheek. "I am in need of a wife. Why shouldn't it be you?" He jested, surely. The man wanted her to go back on her word or some such thing. No one suggested marriage after a mere 10-minute walk. "I think you are either a cruel man or one without a sense of humour," she said, keeping her tone even and watching as his dimple vanished with his smile. "Dangling a duchy in front of a woman has to be poor manners, if nothing else." She untangled her arm from his and continued her walk, glaring now at the house that belonged to a man completely undeserving of its elegant artistry. The crunch of gravel behind her alerted her to his hasty steps. He caught up with her easily, of course. "My lady, I did not mean to offend you. I spoke the truth. Perhaps I was too candid." "You could marry anyone," she argued without looking at him. She came to the corner and turned, walking toward their mothers again. "You needn't have unsuitable maidens visit your home so you can tease them in this way." "I am not teasing, Lady Cecilia." He captured her hand and she stopped rather than create a scene. In fact, she smiled brightly at her mother so the Countess wouldn't think anything amiss before she whirled around to glare up at the Duke. He released her hand slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I remember when I met you. I thought your eyes the most unique and beautiful thing I had ever seen." She blinked. That hadn't been what she expected to hear. "When you gave me your condolences, you said something more than the empty words others used. Do you remember? It took me aback. You said, 'I hope your father's memory blesses you with guidance and joy.'" "I remember." She had watched as person after person met the young Duke and expressed insincere sorrow for his loss. They said the words society expected them to say, and he had looked so alone and sad. Distant, too, from everything around him. When the hostess of that evening had introduced Cecilia, she had said what she felt. "I ought not to have spoken with you so familiarly, most likely. It was exactly what I needed." His smile returned, though it appeared less certain than before. "I forgot all about where we met. I even forgot it was you who said those things to me until last evening. But I remembered your eyes and your words when my mother mentioned your name. What you said that evening showed kindness and compassion. What you said today is even more revealing of your character." Replacing her parasol on her shoulder, she twirled the handle and stared up at him. "A quarter of an hour in my company, all told, is not enough for you to suggest I am an appropriate choice for matrimony." "My mother likes you." "And I like her." The Duchess of Montfort is known for her charitable works and progressive views on the education of women. She stopped twirling the parasol. However, that does not mean I am suitable for the position. I thought you said you had no objection to being a duchess. You certainly sound as though you object to the idea now. He folded his arms across his chest and tipped his head to the side, studying her. Cecilia threw her free hand to the side, gesturing to the gardens around him. I object to the absurd manner in which you present the idea. Ah, so if I called upon your father with a proposition for taking your hand in marriage, that would be better? You will not call upon my father. I might. His lips twitched again. The man had no sense at all. He began their walk looking decidedly against the very idea of her presence and ended it with a near proposal of matrimony. We should court first. Why? Because society expects it? He smiled fully and offered her his arm once again. She took it, and he surprised her by turning around to walk back the way they had come, prolonging their walk. What is the advantage of being a duke if you cannot flout society on occasion? She eyed him thoughtfully. Are you quite well, Your Grace? I am in the best of health. You confuse me terribly. His smile broadened, and she very much liked the reappearance of his dimple. My mother gave me to believe that you would be a perfect duchess because of your maturity and gravity. I cannot be all that difficult to understand if what she said is true. I do know how to conduct myself when in company, Your Grace. This entire ridiculous conversation is your fault. I only meant to be honest with you. His tone grew wistful. I have not been ridiculous in a long time. Cecilia studied him again, then drew a little nearer. I cannot think anyone expects dukes to be anything other than men of sobriety. Ah, and that is the heart of so many issues. You see, I did not think I would be a duke so soon. Cecilia's heart clenched at the sadness in his voice. She nodded her understanding. It cannot be an easy thing. I hope you have people in your life to help you. I imagine the burdens of a duke are many. They are. He put his hand over hers. And taking a duchess is one of the few things that eases those burdens, especially if she is honest, practical, and does not mind the occasional moment of ridiculousness. Her cheeks grew hot, and this time Cecilia did not look to blame the sun. He would grow tired of this idea soon enough, wouldn't he? Dukes do not propose marriage this way. When they finally returned to the Duchess and Countess, the mothers exchanged one knowing glance with each other before plying their children with tea, cakes, and conversation about the weather. Every unmarried woman in London would throw themselves at the Duke of Montfort's feet. He could not really mean to court someone like Cecilia, let alone wed her. 1 week. In 1 week, she wagered he would find someone else to admire. That thought finally relaxed her. She smiled behind the rim of her teacup and told her heart to stop its ridiculous racing. A woman with a practical mindset did not let her heart rule her head. She kept her emotions in check. Cecilia had her own plans. She had schedules. Her life was meticulously laid out before her. She could entertain 1 week of the Duke's nonsense. Then it would be over. Chapter 3. The young Duke of Montfort spent the better part of the day debating with himself the merits of Lady Cecilia. He strode through one of the long corridors, the walls on either side lined with artwork accumulated with painstaking care by his forebearers. He slipped beneath an arch, flanked on either side by depictions of Grecian muses, and into his mother's favourite sitting room. One word came to mind. Refreshing, he said when he stepped into the room. His mother looked up at him with a raised eyebrow. She held a list in her hand, and the woman with her, Mrs. Henry, looked at him with puzzlement. Mrs. Henry, a distant cousin to his mother, had acted as her companion in London for years. "What is it that you find so refreshing, Montfort? It cannot be my company." She lowered the list to her lap and gave a nod to the other woman, dismissing her. The woman curtsied to the Duke before disappearing through another door to wait upon the Duchess. Gregory strode across the room to a large window overlooking Piccadilly Street. "I find Lady Cecilia's mannerisms refreshing." "As do I. She has a way of expressing herself one cannot help but admire." If his mother had any notion of the woman's forthright words to him, Gregory doubted she would continue to feel that way. What sort of woman told a duke she did not think herself a worthy wife? He smiled to himself. You are taken with her. His mother sounded pleased with herself. Excellent. I have always trusted your instinct with people. Your intuition will serve you well here too. I will arrange a dinner with them, I think, and a dozen other guests to keep tongues from wagging prematurely. What? Gregory turned around. A dinner? Yes, courtship must begin among family. Mother. He resisted the urge to rub at his temples. His day, already full of social and political engagements, had worn at him. Is this necessary? I met Lady Cecilia. I need only have a conversation with her father, another with her, and it is done. His mother levelled a severe frown upon him. You will go about this properly. I have no intention of creating fodder for gossip. A dinner, a few public meetings. Then, if you still like the woman, you may apply for a special licence from the Archbishop. Once the decision is made final, I see no reason to delay. You have planned out the entirety of the courtship. It shouldn't surprise him. But how would Lady Cecilia react to having such a scheduled set of steps to becoming the new Duchess of Montfort? She had struck him as someone with not only a sharp mind, but someone who had her life well ordered. When meeting him had interfered with whatever she thought her life ought to look like, she had taken matters into her own hands to tell him he was a temporary disruption at most. He liked that especially about her. His role in the kingdom meant few would tell him their honest thoughts about him. 3 weeks, the Duchess said, picking up the list she had discarded. Here we are, week 1, meeting 2. She handed him the paper, and Gregory took it with a barely repressed sigh. Mother, I am grown, and a duke. And if you didn't like her, you would not even entertain my ideas. We both know you have a mind of your own. She picked up a cup of tea that waited at her elbow. Do not pretend I am compelling you along a path you do not wish to take. I would never. He tried not to smile as he finally lowered himself into a chair near hers. Although your thoroughness is somewhat alarming. Because if it were up to you, you would not look for a duchess until you solved half the kingdom's problems. I know you, duke or not, because you are my son. When you set your mind to something, you have such single-minded focus that you neglect everything else. A remarkable quality, until it isn't. Gregory looked more closely at the paper in his hands rather than argue with his mother. 3 weeks, he said again as he studied it. She had laid it out, day by day, with military precision. Most days he would not see Cecilia at all, and never alone. Dinners, garden parties, strolling in the park and meeting with her father were the few times he would interact with the Earl's family at all. But his mother would be with either Cecilia or her mother nearly every day. Anyone paying attention would see the current Duchess grooming a young lady to follow in her footsteps, a sure sign of approval and forthcoming nuptials without any announcement actually made. It would also give Cecilia time to decide if she wanted to be a duchess or not, which would not be a simple choice. If she decides she would rather not accept my proposal, what then? He asked his mother, peering over the edge of the paper at her. Then I politely see her a few more times in public, with her mother, and everyone carries on thinking I found her a delightful young lady. Her marriage prospects will certainly improve, even if people think you showed interest for a brief time, without our actions ever explicitly confirming such a thing. You play a clever game, Mother. The Duchess lifted her eyebrows nearly to her hairline. Had I been born a man, I would most certainly have tried for a position as a general. Gregory chuckled and handed the paper back to his mother. The king is unfortunate in his limitation to men when it comes to choosing his tacticians. She chuckled and placed the list upon the table beside her teacup. I will have a copy of the schedule sent to your secretary. With that much decided, his mother turned the conversation to other matters. She always asked about his work in Lords with interest. She had discussed many political decisions with the late Duke before his vote was ever required on a law. Despite her sex, the Duchess had a keen mind for politics. She had to if she expected to assist her husband in his parliamentary duties. When Gregory left the house to take his seat in Lords, he did not leave all domestic concerns behind, because there was every chance that Lady Cecilia would rethink her stance on the desire to be a duchess. She had not taken him seriously in the garden, he knew, and attending teas and salons with the current Duchess might not impress upon her the seriousness of his decision to wed her. A quick thump of his walking stick on the roof of his private carriage alerted the driver to a change in plan. "Grosvenor Square!" Gregory shouted up. Then he folded his arms across his chest and leaned back as much as he dared to without disturbing his blasted, powdered hair. Cecilia occupied herself in the later afternoons by sitting out of doors on pleasant days. Everyone else in the household took naps to prepare for an evening out or to recover from a ball the night before. Such was the way of things during the social season. Parliament in session meant all of London became a playground for the wealthy members of English society. Thus she was alone when the footman arrived bearing a card. "My lady." He bowed and held the silver tray out to her. She laid down her book and took up the slip of thick paper. Her eyes narrowed. "The Duke has come?" "Yes, my lady." She looked toward the house, only to see the man in question already exiting the door into the garden. "Good heavens!" She put the card in her book and snapped it closed. "Has my father been informed?" The footman's eyes widened marginally. "No, my lady, His Grace asked for you directly." She stood, then sat down again, then stood as the Duke of Montfort stepped between the last two rose bushes between them. Curtsying deeply, from the corner of her eye she saw the footman scurry away, not waiting for a dismissal or further instructions. She did not blame him for his retreat. A duke's presence would intimidate just about anyone in the kingdom. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure." "Unexpected or unwanted?" Though he did not sound arrogant, not precisely, he seemed rather sure of himself. Perhaps, as a duke, he was accustomed to people fawning over him or fearing him. Rising from her curtsy, Cecilia folded her hands before her and gazed directly into his eyes. His visit need not intimidate her. Not if he still held on to the notion of marrying her, silly as that notion was. Perhaps he had appeared to apologize to her and withdraw his hasty proposal. "As I wasn't doing anything of importance, I do not mind your interruption of my day." She gestured to the garden around them even as she noted to herself that his smile grew. "If you promise to be better company than the flowers, I might even welcome you." "I doubt anyone could be better company than nature's damsels," he said, surprising her. He looked about the garden with interest. "Do you spend a lot of time out here?" "Yes, I find it peaceful." She folded her hands before her and studied him closely. Why had he come? Surely a duke did not mince words. Not when what he had to say might change the fate of the nation or that of anyone within the sound of his voice. "My mother has a great love of green and growing things." He gestured to the narrow footpath. Their garden was less than a quarter the size of his. She doubted his mother would find anything impressive about it. "Will you walk with me a moment?" "Of course, Your Grace." She took his offered arm and squelched the rustle of excitement threatening her stomach. She could not allow her attraction to carry her away, especially since she could not be certain where it had come from. Pragmatic as she thought herself, Cecilia had accepted her parents would one day arrange her marriage. That meant she actively kept herself from admiring any man of her acquaintance. She kept them all at a distance from her heart, even if she found their thoughts interesting or their appearance pleasing, because there was absolutely no use in harbouring affection for someone to whom she held no attachment. "You are kind to take the time to humour me, my lady." "I think there are few who would deny a duke any request, Your Grace." When he said nothing after taking several steps, Cecilia peered up at the duke with her head tilted to one side. "I must have made quite the impression on Your Grace." She did not give him time to answer before adding, "I am told I am an exceptional walker, but for one as exalted as you to seek me out not once but twice to stroll about a patch of green, I must surely promote my talents more." She saw his lips twitch and her stomach spasmed pleasantly. "You should have cards made up with my endorsement. Lady Cecilia, a most excellent walker, approved by the Duke of Montfort." She had to stifle a laugh. Ladies certainly did not laugh while on the arm of a duke. "Indeed, perhaps I shall. If nothing else, it will serve as a most amusing introduction." In a tone as light as before, the duke said, "I would much rather introduce you as my Duchess." Her chest tightened and that pleasantly unpleasant sensation in her stomach returned, accompanied by a new symptom, palpitations of her heart. "You do not mean that, Your Grace." "But I do." He stopped their walk and turned to face her, taking her ungloved hands in both of his. His skin was warm, his grip gentle enough that she could pull away but firm enough that she found herself foolishly admiring the strength in his hands. "I wanted to discover if my impression of you remained the same. We've only met twice, but I am still certain. My instincts tell me that you will be a formidable duchess and a charming companion." Her mother had raised Cecilia in the ways of a high-ranking noblewoman, Cecilia knew her future duties to husband, children, and household. She knew, too, that she would likely marry for connections rather than any sort of affection. Why, then, did the Duke's interest make her feel like laughing and crying all at once? Regaining her sense, she looked down at their joined hands. A Duchess did more than look after her family and home. A Duchess served her nation at her Duke's side. That was the reason for her accelerated heartbeat, her sudden dizziness, intimidation. I told myself you would forget about me within a week, Your Grace. She raised her gaze slowly to his. His smile appeared fully, revealing his hidden dimple and a twinkle in his eyes. I admire your honesty, my lady, though I must ask, did you think so little of me or of yourself to make such a guess? Neither. She weighed her answer, not wishing to give offence. But you could have any woman you wished for your wife. The daughter of a new peer seems an unlikely choice. I know enough about your family to find agreeable consequences to the connection. He gently squeezed her hands and drew her nearer. And while I sense you are equal to the title of Duchess, there is more. I find you quite alluring. She laughed, startling them both. For the first time the Duke appeared surprised. Alluring, she repeated, voice full of mirth she did nothing to hide. Your Grace, I am as vain as any other woman about my good qualities, but I am also well aware that I am no beauty. Brown hair, blue eyes, and an average appearance in all other ways. I am not alluring. His eyebrows drew together and he leaned towards her to speak in a solemn manner. I spoke as much of your wit as I did of your appearance, but let me be clear on that account too. You are lovely to look upon, Lady Cecilia, and I should be proud to have the privilege of escorting you anywhere for as long as I live. The weight of his words settled upon her like a thick woolen blanket, wrapping her in warmth that she thought might turn as smothering as it was comforting. Perhaps he did find her alluring, but once he solved the mystery of her person, he would care only for the abilities she possessed. He wouldn't care much for her character if she failed in her responsibilities as a Duchess. She looked away, but his fingertips brushed beneath her chin, drawing her gaze back to him. What is it you want, more than anything? He asked, his voice soft and his eyes intent upon hers. He leaned closer, waiting for her to impart her secrets. Tell me what it is, and I will do all in my power to grant it to you. 1,000 dreams flitted through her mind, but the grandest one of all she could not voice. No one, not even a duke, would let a woman become an architect, especially not if he meant for her to busy herself as a duchess. She settled for something near to the desire of her heart. I wish to visit and study the greatest buildings in England, Wales, and Scotland. Some day I want to visit the most beautiful palaces in Europe. To see such things with my own eyes, to study them in their place of history and culture, would fulfill my desire. At least, she hoped it would. Done. He spoke the single word with such declarative emphasis that she blinked in surprise. How can you promise that? I am a duke. I will take you anywhere you want to go, as duty permits. Even as far away as Russia, if you wish. The Tsar is married to a cousin of mine. He gave her a crooked smile, and she glimpsed mischief within him that must have driven any number of nurses and tutors to their wits' end. But what can I possibly give you in return? She asked, aghast. Your hand in marriage, to start. He lifted her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss upon her knuckles. Your companionship and counsel after that. He put his arm around her, his hand at the small of her back. He drew her closer. Maybe an heir, if we can manage it, though I have no objection to raising as many daughters as you like. He tilted his head down just so, bringing his lips near hers. You are serious, she whispered, feeling his warm breath upon her lips. Increasingly so. I have good instincts, you see. If you think we might suit one another. She stopped his words with a kiss, bridging the final inches between his lips and hers. It was her first. The way he brought her closer, the expertise with which he made her lose all sense of time with nothing but the press of his mouth, made her believe he had practiced such a thing before. She would marry the Duke. For practical reasons, she told herself as she stepped away from him at last. For her family's honour and position. for the power it would give her to do good and fulfill at least a few of her dreams. Practicality served her above all else. After all, what woman would ever say no to a duke? Chapter 4. A duke must marry by special license, especially when his mother had blood ties to the archbishop. The wedding sacrament wasn't at Westminster, however. Gregory didn't allow his mother to press that issue. Instead, he chose the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great, which also meant limiting the number of people invited to see him pledge his life to Cecilia Boxbury. Of course, the Crown Prince attended as the representative of his family. The king had taken another ill turn, and the Queen remained with him. Other royals sat along one side of the church. Cecilia stood next to him before the altar, in a gown of palest rose with a train that glistened with gems and golden thread. She tilted her head at a perfect angle, showing both reverence for the Holy Sacrament and respect for her new position as his wife. When they turned around, presented as husband and wife to all those present, Gregory struggled to keep his gaze off her. Her gloved hand trembled in his grasp, and he saw her look from one side of the chapel to the other as her face paled. With a squeeze of his hand, he brought her attention back to him. "Your Grace," he murmured beneath the sound of the organ's joyful music, "our carriage awaits." That brought her chin back up, and the momentary waver in her confidence disappeared. He led her from the church and into the open air of London. A crowd of people, curious about the wedding of a duke to a duchess, lined the path to the carriage. He knew none of them, but his wife smiled and nodded at a few. She looked up at him, her eyes brighter. "My family's servants," she explained amid the cheering. That explained it. The servants at his London house would make ready to meet her in the courtyard. Those who were not putting finishing touches on the lavish wedding breakfast the guests would soon descend upon. A piece of tradition he anticipated with both irritation and elation. Once ensconced in their carriage, Gregory seated beside his wife, he finally allowed himself to relax for the first time that day. He had barely slept the night before, hadn't eaten a thing. Despite the marriage negotiations and Cecilia's promise to wed, he had worried. What if she had changed her mind? Though they married for practical reasons, as a duke could never hope to marry for anything less or more, he knew what was expected of a husband. Eventually they might form a bond of mutual affection. Until then, there were steps to take, a role to fulfill. He must encourage her, kiss and embrace her, bestow sincere compliments to assuage her doubts. "You are beautiful, Cecilia." She startled and turned away from the window, looking at him with her wide blue eyes. He found her hand resting on the seat between them and took it up in his. "You make a marvellous bride, and you look every inch a duchess." Her cheeks turned the same shade of her gown, and she lowered her gaze to their joined hands. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Gregory." He brought her gloved hand to his lips, drawing her gaze to the same. "You are one of the few in this world who may call me by my given name." He found watching her pleasant. More than pleasant. She was beautiful, attractive. His practical choice in a bride was also a most agreeable choice. "Would not Montfort be more appropriate?" she asked, her eyebrows drawing together. "That is what your mother calls you. What the prince called you when you introduced him this morning." "As you are not my mother," he said, lips brushing against the soft silk of her glove, "and you are certainly not the future King of England, I think it reasonable, even preferable, that you address me differently than either of them do." The delicate shade of pink in her cheeks gave him leave to believe she found his attention pleasant. Her free hand played with the ribbons of her bonnet, upon which the bridal veil remained gently draped, flowing across her shoulders. "As you wish, Gregory." He kissed the knuckles of her glove again, then gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "The ordeal of the wedding breakfast will not tire you too greatly, I hope. Because some of our guests are royal, they will expect us to stay longer than people would normally expect of a bride and groom." Her cheeks flooded with colour again. He found he very much enjoyed causing that response, though he did not always understand how he managed it. This time was clear enough. The implications of what went on between a man and woman on their wedding day would surely be in her thoughts as they went through his. When she paled and gently withdrew her hand, he nearly spoke to reassure her. But the horse's hooves struck the ground with a familiar clatter, the one which always preceded the entrance to Dinard House, and his thoughts turned to other matters. "The servants are enthusiastic about welcoming you, Cecilia." Her expression smoothed into a gentle smile, and she tilted her head almost regally. "I hope they will not mind your choice of Duchess, your Gregory. They have a reputation to maintain." "They are at your command." The carriage came to a stop. "And I think they will enjoy living up to your expectations." A liveried footman opened the door, and Gregory left the carriage. He took in the way the household had arranged themselves on either side of the stairs, everyone standing at attention as well as any soldier on parade, and he could not keep from giving them an approving nod before reaching inside to assist his wife from the carriage. She stepped out, a gently approving smile already upon her lips. His wife, Her Grace the Duchess of Montfort, Cecilia Dinard. A woman he sensed would change his life and guide the duchy into a bright new future. As the morning progressed, everything he observed reassured him he had chosen correctly. From Cecilia's deft interactions with the highest-ranking servants to her warm welcome of their esteemed wedding guests. They sat on opposite ends of the long dining room, the prince himself at Cecilia's right hand. They stood together to bid farewell to their guests until Cecilia quietly excused herself. Gregory stayed at the top of the grand staircase until the prince took his leave. He then went to the family wing, where his wife's quarters adjoined his, walking with lightness in his steps. "Montfort?" His mother sat in a chair just outside the corridor that would lead him to his bride. "Mother." He held both hands out to her, though she did not need his help to rise from her chair. She looked tired, however. Many of the day's preparations had fallen to her, as they must until Cecilia could handle the running of the household on her own. "The day is a success, I think." He kissed her cheek. "I should hope so." She stepped back, her keen eyes studying his face. "You are happy, Montfort?" "I am." He admitted that readily enough, though he kept his ducal composure. "I think we have an excellent new Duchess." "I agree. Cecilia is a lovely woman, with greater intelligence than most of the silly girls that flutter through society these days." Her chin came up. "Nevertheless, she is a young woman, gently bred. I should hope I have raised you to know how best to treat such a lady. You must be a considerate husband, Montfort." His mother's sudden concern, coupled with a searching gaze, made Gregory's smile falter. "Of course, mother. She is my wife under my protection. Her every concern is mine, her every need mine to fulfill." She did not appear reassured, though she lowered her gaze with a sigh. "Congratulations, my son. I hope your marriage will prove happy." She offered her cheek, which he kissed again, and then she walked away, not to her chambers, but into the corridors leading to the public parts of the house. Gregory did not waste time wondering what his mother was about. He went straight to his chambers, through the sitting room and to the bedroom. A door adjoined his wife's room to his, and he went to it with a rush of excitement. He had not been alone with Cecilia since the walk in her family's garden when she had agreed to marry him. The last fortnight had been taken up with solicitors and marital contracts, seeking permission from the Crown to wed, and his usual work in Parliament. He lifted his hand to knock, then stopped when a strange sound assaulted his ears. A sound he had not expected at all, and so incongruent with his feelings for the day that he could not at first identify what he heard. His new wife, on the other side of the door, was crying as if her heart had broken. Gregory let his hand fall limply to his side, considering what he must do. If she regretted marrying him so soon after their vows, would she want to see him? Perhaps. But as her husband, it fell to him to see to her needs, all of them. He opened the door without knocking and looked inside. On the edge of the bed sat his wife in all her wedding finery, her face buried in a handkerchief. Gregory stepped inside. "Cecilia?" She hiccuped and lifted her head. "Gregory," she sniffled, "did I disturb you?" Her voice warbled uncertainly. He came to her side with slow, deliberate steps. Why did he feel as though he approached a wounded deer? Disturbed? No, but I am concerned for you. Are you unwell? She slowly shook her head, her deep blue eyes widening. No. Oh, I am sorry. I should not carry on like this. I'm not even sure why I am crying, only that I am and I cannot. She gasped. Stop. She sobbed anew. He came to sit beside her somewhat gingerly. Cecilia, please, is there anything I can do? Do you regret our wedding? If she did, how would he right the situation? More attention? Lavish compliments and gifts? No! She cried harder after her answer. Hesitantly, Gregory placed his hand on her back. It seemed to be the right thing to do, given the way she immediately turned to bury her face in the front of his waistcoat. He put his whole arm around her, holding her close. This wasn't at all how he'd pictured things between them so soon after the wedding, and he suspected not all new husbands would handle the situation as he did. It would have been far easier to slink off to another part of the house until her tears were spent, than pretend he knew nothing about it. But that was cowardly. And Gregory wasn't a coward. He rocked gently as he held her, murmuring soothing words, reassuring her she was safe, promising she would feel better. And slowly, her tears abated, until she only shuddered once every few minutes. There now. He smoothed her hair away from her face, peering at her. Her face was pale except for splotches of red beneath her eyes and around her nose. He didn't even look at his waistcoat and had no intention of explaining to his valet the state it was in. Are you feeling any better? She nodded once, then whispered, I apologize, Gregory. Thank you for being so kind. I promise I am well. I will believe you after you tell me what made you cry. Her bottom lip trembled. Was it me? She shook her head. My mother? One of our guests? No, she said, though it came out more as a moan. It is only me being rather foolish. You assured me you were a practical woman, my dear Duchess. He smiled at her gently, keeping his words light and teasing. You cannot possibly be foolish. Her laugh was weak, but at least it was a laugh. I started thinking, she said at last, about everything this means. She gestured to him with one fair hand. I married a duke. Yes, I was there, he reminded her. Her eyes narrowed and he grinned in response. That makes me a duchess. That is generally how it works. He grinned larger when she smiled at him. Would you rather have married a cobbler or a dairy farmer? Not in the least. She lowered her gaze to her hands where they joined in her lap, clutching her sodden handkerchief. But I wonder if you would have rather married someone else. Someone more suited to the role. Surrounded by all those people today, I cannot help but feel wanting. Cecilia, look at me, please. He took her hand between his as she lifted her gaze once more. I would not have asked if I did not think you capable of this role. He did not blink or look away from her as he vowed. And I will help you in every way I can. You will learn. I promise. It was his duty to teach her, guide her, and he would do so. His practical match needed cultivating. She hiccuped and then she nodded solemnly. Thank you. I will do my best. I promise. He kissed his wife's forehead, marvelling that she belonged to him and he to her. His chest warmed as he drew her back against him, holding her and offering comfort as he so wished someone had comforted him when he realized what it meant to be a duke. A little encouragement and she would be well. He had chosen an intelligent and charming woman to wed. All would be well. Cecilia wouldn't face her new responsibilities alone as he had done. He would see to that. Chapter 5. Cecilia spent the first week of her marriage at her mother-in-law's elbow. From the time she rose in the morning until she laid down at night, her mind bent to the single task of learning everything she needed to know about her role as a duchess. At night, her time was not her own either, as she came to learn what every new bride must about being a wife. Her mother-in-law's voice broke into her thoughts. "Cecilia, are you quite all right? You have turned pink." "Oh, yes. Perhaps it is too warm near the window." Cecilia rose from her place, a chair in the sunlight of the Greek room. It was the dowager's favourite place to sit in the mornings, though Cecilia did not particularly care for the icy blues and whites of the decor, or the busts of Roman statues scattered about the room. She settled herself on the same couch as the Dowager Duchess. "You were saying, Your Grace?" "I think it is time I throw you a ball. You will take part in all the planning, of course." Her mother-in-law sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her companion was in a chair near at hand. "You have grasped the daily requirements of the household with admirable speed. We must present you with a challenge." "Must we?" Cecilia longed to say, but she pressed her lips together and nodded agreement instead. The Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman, intimidated her on several counts. She had taken on Cecilia's training as a general would his newest troops, with fervour and a touch of grudging approval when Cecilia rose to the challenge. Not that her new mother-in-law was unfriendly. She was quite kind in her way when they discussed things other than household matters and duchy duties. But since Cecilia had much to learn, such moments were rare. Out loud, Cecilia asked, "Is there a precedent for the timing of this ball?" "There hasn't been a wedding such as yours in decades. And as we are the ones who set such precedents, no one could say a bridal ball is too late or too soon when I am the one issuing the invitations." She smiled with smug satisfaction before reaching for her teacup. "With Parliament nearing retirement for the season, it is also an excellent time for Montfort to have one last event with his most important political allies in attendance. We will make a statement on that front, too. Have you studied the political news, as I asked?" "Yes, Your Grace." Cecilia had combed through every news sheet and pamphlet her mother-in-law had put before her. Any mention of Gregory she had noted, but she had also learned which lords he counted as allies and those who were political enemies. There was so much more to her new role as Duchess than she had anticipated, and she had expected her duties to overwhelm her. She picked up her abandoned plate of cucumber sandwiches and nibbled at one, not really tasting it as she listened to the Dowager give a detailed description of the last ball she had held before her late husband's passing. "A ball is a pleasant thing as an unmarried woman. As the hostess, you will find the undertaking more arduous than enjoyable. However, there is immense satisfaction in an evening carried off well." She laid out her plans for more than half an hour, then dismissed Cecilia. The next hour was her own, and then the visits would begin. Today was Cecilia's at-home day. She escaped to the library. She had only glimpsed it briefly during a tour of the house before her marriage. Finally, she had the chance to enjoy the room that had called to her the moment she laid eyes upon it. This room in Dinard House appealed to her sensibilities far more than any other. For one thing, the colours used in the paper and hangings consisted of darker hues, rich greens and sombre browns with dark wood furniture. For another, no other room was as quiet, thanks to thick plush rugs and shelves lined in leather volumes of books. Here Cecilia could sit and think and admire the exquisite lines of the windows and room. If she went all the way back to her rooms, on the opposite side of the house, she'd be far too tempted to take up her pencil and sketchbook to make note of her favourite design elements of the house, or flee to the gardens and attempt to lose herself in the geometrical shrubbery. Closing her eyes, Cecilia leaned her head against the back of the couch, only to jerk forward again when the carved wooden spine of the chair poked her unpleasantly. Library furniture ought to be more comfortable, especially if people used the library as they ought, sitting to read or engage in intelligent conversation. She looked at the nearest chair and grimaced as she studied the wooden arms, carved with depictions of pheasants and foxes. The artistry was exquisite. The comfort of the chair? Non-existent. Cecilia rose and walked through the room, mentally cataloguing each piece of furniture with increasing irritation. Every stick of furniture in the room was festooned with carvings, or covered over in stiff cloth more appropriate for a horse blanket than a reading chair. She came to the last corner of the room, where a deep-set window had a cushioned seat. She opened the interior wooden shutters herself, folding them back to let in the late morning sunlight. She knelt upon the seat, unlatched the window, and attempted to push it open. But the window stuck. Though she checked the latch again, assuring she had turned it the right way, she could not get it to budge. For a moment she rested her hands on her waist and glared at the window, then peered through it to the courtyard. Potted ferns rested between the columns on the opposite side, their fronds waving gently in a breeze Cecilia had a sudden need to feel on her skin. She tried the window again, straining to pull the edge of the window upward. A pair of arms went around her, hands grasping the window at either side. She froze, until a familiar voice said beside her ear, "Let's try together. 1, 2, 3. On 3 they both lifted, and the window opened and slid upward without any more difficulty. Cecilia swallowed and turned her head just enough to see her husband's face, turned upward as he studied the window. "No window in this house should be so difficult to open. I will have someone look into it." Then he met her gaze and smiled. "What are you doing in the library?" An irrational desire to flee the room seized her, and something of that thought must have shown on her face. Immediately her husband stepped away from her and he cleared his throat. "You have every right to be in here, of course. In any room of the house. I only meant that I had not encountered you in this room yet. Not since we married." 1 week ago, she reminded him, turning from her kneeling position to face him, her feet touching the floor once more. "I have not yet spent much time in here, it is true. I had a spare moment today, and I remembered how tranquil this room seemed from my tour." "Ah, tranquil." He looked around as though trying to find something in the library that might be described that way. "I do not spend much time in here myself. Once I have found what I am looking for, that is. Have you seen our library register?" He gestured vaguely to the middle of the library. Slowly she shook her head. "I have not." She rose to her feet, folding her hands demurely before her. "Gregory, do not read in the library." "Not if I can help it." He gestured to the nearest chair, its legs curved out and carved with open-moored lions and vines. "I find the furnishings are rather distracting. I'm never certain if they're going to eat me." He pointed at a couch with various fruits sprouting from its middles. "Or if I ought to eat them." Cecilia kept back her amused giggle and stepped around her husband. "Why not change the furniture, then?" "My mother chose all of this for the library a mere 5 years ago. Changing things again this soon, ordering all new furniture, would not be responsible. Though I am a duke, even my funds are limited," he admitted, leaning against the window frame. "Neither she nor my father spent any time in this room. That isn't to say anything against their literary interests." He looked at the deep green velvet curtains. "But they meant this room to impress guests and stimulate conversation, not provide a haven for someone with a desire to lose themselves in a book." "Were it up to me, I would move these chairs into a sitting room." She ran her finger along a lion's mane. "A sitting room where I brought guests I had no intention of entertaining longer than I must." He chuckled and she raised her eyes to his with surprise. The Duke came forward and she steeled herself against his touch. But he kept walking to one of the uncomfortable couches. He sat and exhaled loudly. "This couch would discourage guests from lingering too." "I suppose that was a rather shocking thing for me to say." She hesitantly lowered herself to the chair across from him. She had spent little time with her husband, other than at the dinner table, where they sat at opposite ends of a long table with company always attending them, and in her room after they retired to bed. But they spent little time in conversation at that point in the evening. "Not at all shocking. In fact, I wish I had thought of such a thing before." Cecilia considered the chair upon which she sat and lowered her eyes to the carpet. "Apart from the furniture, I quite like it here. Would I give insult to your mother, do you think, if I brought a comfortable chair into this room?" "Remember, my mother cares little for the library. Even if she had a firm opinion on the matter, this is your house, Cecilia. You are the Duchess now." His eyes gleamed at her with unmasked admiration, and her stomach twisted about as though ascending a spiral stair. "Make this house your home in whatever way you wish." "All very well and good to say, but I cannot think that any woman in society, high or low, would risk offending her new mother-in-law. It would be incautious." Gregory's lips twitched again. "Mother will not care if you move furniture from one room to another. I promise." She relaxed. "Then I will undertake that project soon. After our ball." One eyebrow quirked upward. "We are having a ball?" "Yes, a bridal ball, your mother called it, to celebrate our wedding." He sighed with an added touch of drama. "I suppose it is to be the culminating event of the season." She pressed her lips together, then gave in and released her amused smile. "Something like that." Gregory appeared remarkably relaxed, given the uncomfortable couch he sat upon. "Mother always ensures that when people leave London for the country that she's the last thing they'll remember about the season. She's famous for her parties, balls and salons." A thought that had niggled at the back of Cecilia's mind came to the forefront again, and she studied it carefully before asking, "Where do we go at the end of the season?" She had never thought to ask before, never paid attention to the movements of those above her in society to have an idea. Her husband's expression changed, his smile flattened and his eyes dimmed. "We used to retire to the castle in Leicestershire, our ancestral home." Moving to the edge of her seat, Cecily leaned forward with some eagerness. A castle? She had not known he possessed a castle, though she supposed most dukes probably would. "Used to?" she repeated, her voice low. "Do you no longer journey there?" Gregory's eyes focused on hers again, and he attempted a smile that faltered as quickly as an unsupported archway. "Before my father died, he drew up plans to remodel the castle." She held her breath with sudden excitement. A building project? On an ancestral castle? Depending on the age of the building and the amount of change wanted, such a thing could take years to complete. Perhaps her husband would grant her leave to study the building and the work. "Is there a chance? Might there be time this summer, Gregory, for me to visit the castle? I would love to see it and see the work being done." His expression grew darker as he said, "Construction began 8 months before my father's death, and then after, there was a fire." His voice trailed away to nothing and he turned from her. She watched him swallow as he tried to regain control of his emotions, his jaw tight. Guilt smote her heart, and Cecilia rose to cross the room, perching on the couch beside him. She put her hand on his sleeve. "I did not mean to cause you pain, Gregory. I am terribly sorry if my question was insensitive." He looked at her hand on his arm, then covered it with his own. The warmth of his skin caressed the top of her hand, making her reflexively tighten her grip on his arm. His fingers were longer than hers, his palm larger, and they obscured her smaller hand completely. "You could not know. You see, the damage to the castle happened so soon after losing my father that the two are forever linked in my heart. I lost my father and that tie to him. He was quite proud of the designs drawn up with James Wyatt." She did not stifle her gasp in time. "The James Wyatt who built the Pantheon on Oxford Street?" The Duke looked at her sharply, his brow furrowed and eyes narrowed. "The very same." She coloured under his scrutiny. The Pantheon had reached completion 20 years before, and not many in fashionable society spoke of architects and their designs unless they had worked upon something more recent. Cecilia shifted, pulling her hand gently from beneath his. "I can understand your father's enthusiasm for the work, given Mr. Wyatt's reputation for excellence." She fixed what she hoped was a benign smile upon her face. It was best to return to the initial topic rather than give vent to her opinions on Wyatt and his neo-Gothic leanings of late. "Did the fire cause significant loss?" Still wearing a puzzled expression, her husband nodded once. "We lost several important family artefacts, as well as artwork by Titian and Van Dyck." His eyes narrowed when she did not immediately react to those names. Cecilia belatedly made a sound of sympathy. Of course she knew Van Dyck and Titian. Truly, they were some of the most gifted artists in modern history. "A shame, truly." The damage was primarily to a public wing, but it halted the project. Without my father's guiding hand and interest, recovering financially and physically from the fire meant everything had to come to a stop. Builders went home. Mr. Wyatt moved on to more interesting projects. Gregory rose from the uncomfortable couch and went to the open window, his back to her as he drew in a deep breath. "I know I must eventually begin again, but I haven't the mind for it at present. We sealed the damaged rooms off and we did not return last year, nor do I plan to go back this year." "I see." Had Cecilia's answer been any longer, she could not have hidden her disappointment. The interest such a tale stirred in her mind and heart could not bode well for her position as Duchess. It was not a Duchess's place to supervise the building or even rebuilding of a castle. When the time came to see the ancestral home, it must fall to Gregory to oversee the work. In search of another topic of conversation, wanting to draw out their time together, she ventured a question of curiosity. "Gregory, I have noticed something I thought unusual. But perhaps it is merely how things are done in a household of this size. It seems there is always a footman following me about, morning and night if I am out late." For a moment, Gregory's expression turned stony. "Thomas Merrill and John Harper." She blinked. He knew their full names. "Yes, Thomas and John." Footmen were always referred to by their Christian names. "I have no complaints about them. They are well trained. But they seem older than most footmen, and they are most attentive." One corner of his mouth went upward, but the expression appeared rather grim. "They are not ordinary servants. I meant to speak to you about their added duties before now." He sighed and leaned toward her. "As a duke, my position in the kingdom is important. I am connected to the ruling monarchy, the government, and other families of power across Europe. Because of this, there are many who see me as an enemy, or a threat. There have been 2 attempts on my life. There were 3 on my father's." Cecilia's mouth popped open with her gasp. "Surely not. But when? How?" "Stories for another time," he said, turning to look out the window. "I have no wish to ruin your enjoyment of the day with those memories." He released a sigh and faced her again, a new light in his eyes, something that was almost tender. "Merrill and Harper, along with other senior members of the staff, are not merely servants. They are men especially chosen by my father, and now by me, with other experience and skills. They are an informal guard, if you will, for the family. They protect me and those important to me. My mother, you, someday our children." His reassurances did not fully soothe away the shock, though her logical mind took over at once and she noted aloud, "An ingenious idea. Thank you for explaining it to me." "I'm surprised you did not think to ask my mother." Cecilia laughed, the sound brief. "Your poor mother must entertain 1,000 questions from me every day. I thought it best to save a few for you." His smile reappeared, as charming as ever, and a pleasant twist in her stomach made her return it with a shy grin. Then her gaze drifted to a clock upon the nearest mantel. The library boasted 3 fireplaces of median size, all 3 with clocks and busts of famous British poets upon them. "Oh dear, I must go." She stood and brushed at her skirt. "Your mother is expecting me. It is our at-home day." Gregory bowed to her, and Cecilia's cheeks warmed. There were few people in the whole kingdom to whom he must show such respect. She still had a difficult time accepting her place as one of them. "Then I will bid you farewell until dinner, my dear Duchess, where I hope to learn more about our bridal ball." He gifted her a charming smile. She curtsied in return. "Of course. Until then, Gregory." She tried to walk calmly from the room, though something about her conversation with her husband made her heart skip with delight. Maybe she ought to seek him out during the day. He hadn't seemed to mind her company, and she rather liked his, too. Her schedule and his would eventually give them more time together. She hoped. Chapter 6. Gregory arrived home late from Parliament, his head pounding abominably from the latest round of debates in the House of Lords. Despite a young and progressive Prime Minister heading the government, the arguments delivered so near the close of the session bordered on the ridiculous. He wanted nothing more than to retire to the country and forget everything to do with politics. Except his summer calendar had already filled with visits, hunting parties, house parties, and the like, each one a thinly veiled excuse to prepare for another season of politicking. He made his way through the quiet house, noting the only servants still awake were those meant to guard the house more than see to the family's needs. He stopped at the top of the staircase leading to the family wing, taking a moment to examine one of the tall footmen dressed in a sombre suit of black. "Rockwell." The footman bowed. "Your Grace, how may I serve you? Any disturbances this evening?" Gregory eyed the man not much older than himself with respect. Rockwell was second in command of the Duke's Guard. The captain of the small force saw promise in Rockwell. "None, Your Grace." Rockwell stared forward, his body as stiff as a soldier at attention. A complete report of the guard's activities and observations that day would appear on the Duke's desk the next morning. In the past, he hadn't bothered to question his guards often, but of late, with both his mother and Cecilia to protect, he had considered expanding from 12 men to a few more. Not that his mother or wife needed to know he worried over their safety that much, but with the unrest in Europe seeping across the Channel to England, caution was paramount. He nodded to the footman. "As you were, Rockwell." Gregory went to his room, the weight of the day's work heavy upon his shoulders. His valet met him in his dressing room with a glass of port that Gregory waved away. "Enjoy it yourself, Hayworth. I am for bed. Yes, Your Grace." The valet took the glass away with the Duke's clothing, leaving Gregory dressed for bed and wrapped in a fire-warmed dressing gown. A benefit to the position he held meant never having to put on a cold robe, coat, or even boots if he did not wish to. Gregory waited until his valet withdrew before going to the door which divided his room from his bride's. He doubted she would still be awake, not this late. Would it disturb her if he looked in on her? He hadn't seen her for days. "It will ease my mind to see that she is well. I will not wake her." Gregory, though unaccustomed to sneaking about in his own home, entered the room without making a sound. A lamp burned low, resting atop the hearth. He frowned but came further into the room. The spacious chamber held everything needed for a woman to prepare herself for the day and to take her rest at night, as well as a spacious seating area should she wish to keep comfortable in her rooms rather than venture into the rest of the house. Gregory approached the bed with cautious steps, then saw he needn't have worried about waking his wife. Cecilia wasn't in bed at all. Given the precise angle at which the blankets were turned down to receive her, she had not even come to bed that evening. He turned and went to the chair and sofa, and he found the only occupants of the furniture were cushions. Frowning, he swept the room with his gaze, then went to the door and out again into the corridor. He approached the footman on duty, his heart hammering in his chest. There had to be a simple explanation for his wife's absence. Perhaps she had gone to visit her family, though no one had informed him of such a thing. He doubted she could be at a social function this late in the evening, not without him knowing. "Rockwell," he said, still several paces away and perhaps louder than appropriate given the hour. "The Duchess is not in her chambers. Do you know where her Grace might be, given that it is near dawn?" The guard did not so much as flicker an eyelash as he responded, "She is in the blue parlour, Your Grace. Merrill is charged with her care this evening." Merrill had been Gregory's guard as a boy. While the knowledge soothed him somewhat, he did not waste a moment more speaking with the footman. He went back down the stairs, across the ground floor, and then up another flight of stairs in the near darkness of the house. The blue parlour wasn't even in the same wing as the family's chambers. As he approached the room where he hoped to find his wife, he saw the footman standing still as a statue outside the door. "Is my wife still awake?" Gregory asked. "No, Your Grace," Merrill said without apology. "I sent for her maid a moment ago. She has fallen asleep in the room." Gregory stared at the footman. "It is 4 o'clock in the morning. She ought to have been in bed hours ago." The footman bowed his agreement. "Yes, Your Grace. Not that I blame you, Merrill." Gregory's lips twitched. He sighed. "I'll see to her. Send the maid to her Grace's room when she arrives." He entered the room when the footman opened the door for him, and there he found a glowing lantern upon the large circular table, a fire in the hearth, and his wife perched on a chair, head resting atop the writing desk, asleep. Papers lay scattered across the desk, and the light reflected upon several sheets on the floor beneath her. Worry hastened his steps, and Gregory put his hand gently upon her shoulder. Her deep breathing did not change. "Cecilia, my dear, you cannot sleep here." She stirred and murmured something, then her eyes fluttered open. Her body went stiff and she looked upward. "Gregory!" She unfolded herself from the table, a groan escaping her. "What happened? What time is it?" "Nearing dawn, Cecilia. What are you doing in here? You ought to have gone to bed hours ago." She blinked sleepily at him. "What was I doing?" She looked around the room, then down at the desk. Oh dear." She looked about and began gathering up the documents. "These are the acceptance letters for the ball. I had to compare them to the seating arrangements for dinner. We have 34 guests dining with us before others come to the ball." She kept rambling as she left the chair to kneel and gather up more sheets. I know Lord Lansbury and Lady Crompton do not get along, but every time I move them away from each other, it causes mischief with the other guests. Cecilia. Gregory bent and took hold of her forearms. Gently he guided her back to her feet. Leave this until tomorrow. You are exhausted. Indeed, even in the faint glow of the lamp he saw the dark smudges beneath her eyes. Her dark hair, usually twisted and piled elegantly upon her head, had several twists of hair sticking up in odd directions. He glimpsed a stiff feather behind her ear that he suspected was a pen rather than an adornment. "But your mother needs to see that I can do this," she said, shaking her handful of paper. "We have been working for days, and I nearly have all the important guests memorized. I had to sort them out alphabetically first, which I know your mother disapproves of because it really ought to be done by rank. But there are too many factors there, considering one must take into account the ranks of wives, too." A yawn interrupted her words. She covered it with a hand. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. How rude of me." There was nothing for it. He had to take charge. The first year he sat in the House of Lords, he had fallen asleep across his desk more times than he could count. No one had been there to keep him from doing otherwise. His wife would be more fortunate. Cecilia, put the papers down. She looked from him to the sheets in her grasp, then lowered them slowly to the desk. "There is still so much to do," she protested, her voice wobbling with emotion. "Your well-being comes first." He tucked her hand through his arm and led her out of the room. Her steps were slow and she nearly came to a full halt when she yawned. It took twice as long to return her to her quarters as it had to find her. Before they reached her bedroom door, she leaned heavily against his shoulder. The maid waited for her, face pale and eyes looking everywhere except at Gregory. The woman curtsied when they entered. She was in her own night-clothes with a cap and shawl upon her. "Did Her Grace dismiss you for the evening?" Gregory asked as his wife went yawning to her dressing-table. She sank into the chair languidly and began removing hairpins. "Yes, Your Grace. After dinner she said she wouldn't be needing me this evening." The maid kept her eyes downcast. "Then you did nothing wrong," Gregory assured her. "See to it she is comfortable, and do not let anyone disturb her rest. I imagine the Duchess will need to sleep late tomorrow." He left the maid to her mistress and looked over his shoulder only once before returning to his own room via the connecting doorway. His wife's reflection in her mirror showed her pale face, her unfocused gaze, and then he closed the door. He couldn't allow her to continue that way. Without adequate rest, she risked illness. His first task in the morning would be to speak to his mother and take things in hand. Cecilia hadn't been born to her station in life, but that meant easing her into things, not piling responsibilities and knowledge upon her until she could not sleep for fear of making a mistake. His wife needed something more. From him. Would she accept his interference? Alone in his bed, Gregory stared up at the canopied top and debated whether he might share the blame for his wife's state. When he woke the following morning, his head clear, he decided things needed to change. A duchess moved with grace and dignity at all times. No one needed to inform Cecilia of that particular rule, yet she had to remind herself of it several times as she rushed from her chambers to her mother-in-law's favourite drawing-room. The humiliation of sleeping until noon, coupled with her vague memory of the Duke finding her asleep upon a desk, meant her cheeks burned with more than her exertion when she reached the drawing-room doors. A footman stood on either side, looking straight ahead as was their custom. She composed herself with several deep breaths before correcting her posture and giving the slight tip of her head that signalled them to open the doors. She sailed into the room, an apology already scripted and ready for presentment to the Dowager Duchess. Her mother-in-law barely glanced up from the book in her hand. "Cecilia, what are you doing up?" She turned a page. "Montfort made it sound as though you needed to spend the day abed." At the edge of the carpet, Cecilia stood still. "Oh?" Hardly an intelligent response. "I am sure he meant well, Your Grace. I had a late evening, but as you see, here I am." The Dowager Duchess put the book down in her lap and studied Cecilia through narrowed eyes. "Yes. How do you feel, daughter-in-law?" "Rested, Your Grace." Cecilia stepped closer, hoping her smile was confident enough to reassure the older woman. "I trust you are well this morning?" "I am, but my health isn't in question, dear child. Yours is." Cecilia did not draw back or flinch, though her stomach tightened unpleasantly. "I am in perfect health, I assure you." "That isn't what Montfort thinks. He believes I am too harsh a taskmaster. She sniffed disdainfully and patted the empty cushion on the couch beside her. Sit, child. Cecilia did as bid. Duchess or not, no one disobeyed Gregory's mother. But what could the Duke have said to his mother to make her question Cecilia's health? One late night did not an invalid make. Yes, I can see what he meant, the Dowager murmured, peering at Cecilia's face. You have lost some of your colour, and you have bruises beneath your eyes. It is a wonder I did not notice before. Heat suffused Cecilia's face again. As I said, I had a late night, but it is nothing to worry over. Perhaps I expected too much, the Dowager murmured, her expression thoughtful rather than critical. Yet the words stung Cecilia, making her skin prickle and her stomach clench. You have been married 3 weeks. You ought to be glowing, child. Instead, you appear on the verge of a collapse. I assure you, mother, I am well. Cecilia heard the pleading in her voice and changed tactics. There is too much to do to worry over one night of poor sleep. And I have done it all before. Her mother-in-law gave her a consolatory pat to Cecilia's hands where they rested in her lap. The ball is nearly upon us. The day after tomorrow. I want you looking your best and dancing until dawn. So you take your rest, dear girl. Leave the rest of it to me. I am perfectly capable of seeing to the final arrangements, Cecilia said, wincing when her mother-in-law simply shook her head. Though the Dowager Duchess did not say as much, Cecilia knew the woman thought her weak. Why else would she cast Cecilia's efforts aside and insist she rest, like an infant in need of a nap? Gregory believes you need more time, and I must agree with him. The Dowager took up her book again. Why not take a walk in the garden, Cecilia? A little exercise, followed by tea and then a nap, will help you recover your health. Cecilia heard the dismissal, kindly as it was intended, and rose unsteadily to her feet. Yes, Your Grace. She left the room in a daze of embarrassment and uncertainty. She had failed her first test as Duchess. Instead of conquering the planning and execution of her first ball, she had been patted on the head and sent back to the nursery. Her hands curled into fists as she walked down the corridor to her room to fetch her bonnet and gloves. The Dowager had said to take a walk in the garden, and Cecilia could think of nothing better to do. Until she passed a large window that made her stop. She turned and walked to it, staring across the courtyard into another window. The Duke's study, adjacent to the library. His window was open, letting in a breeze, and she could see him at his desk quite clearly, working, as though he hadn't been up all night too. Gritting her teeth in a most un-Duchess-like manner, Cecilia changed course. In fact, she went down the first staircase she came to, the servants', and out the door to the courtyard. There she marched across the gravel, ignoring the feeling of rocks pressing through the bottoms of her slippers, and stopped beneath the Duke's window. She bent, scooped up several small rocks, then lobbed them upward and through the opening. She had the satisfaction of hearing the stones strike wood, along with her husband's startled curse, before he came to the window to glare down at her. What miscreant would dare? Oh, Cecilia. He put both hands on the window's ledge and leaned further out. His hair hadn't been powdered for his daily visit to Lord's yet, which she rather liked. His hair was darker than hers, a thing she only glimpsed late at night and early in the day. Are you throwing pebbles at me? But she hadn't come to admire her handsome husband. She put her hands on her waist and glared at him. I am. His eyebrows drew down. Why? I thought it fair enough to besiege you, given your attack on my person earlier today. Attack? What are you talking about? His frown deepened. Are you quite well? At that question, she scooped up another small stone and hurled it at him. He dodged to the side, but she had the satisfaction of nearly hitting him. She almost laughed and for the first time wondered if he might be right. She had never acted so ridiculous in her life. Perhaps she did need more sleep. But that was neither here nor there. It wasn't up to the Duke to decide such things for her. You cannot decide that I need more sleep, she said aloud, glaring at him as fiercely as she knew how. She hadn't spent a lot of time glaring at people in the past. I am not an infant to be coddled. If I think I am well enough to plan a ball, then I am well enough. Understanding transformed her husband's face from grumpy confusion to something gentler but nearly as upsetting. Patience. Oh, that. Cecilia, I'm coming down. Folding her arms across her chest, Cecilia said nothing. She waited, her eyes upon the nearest door at ground level. Her heart pounded faster with each second as she anticipated his appearance. When it opened, the Duke came out while glancing about the courtyard. Perhaps she had embarrassed him with her display. She didn't care. "Cecilia, I did not wish to offend you, but I could see no help for it. I had to speak to my mother to ensure she had not laid too many responsibilities on you. Have you had breakfast this morning?" The abrupt change in topic made her blink. "No, I overslept and needed to meet with your mother. Or so I thought. But what has that got to do with anything?" "Everything." Gregory approached her somewhat cautiously. Perhaps he expected another volley of pebbles, this time at close range. "You are not taking care of yourself because you are working too hard at becoming a duchess." "I am a duchess," she argued, "and there is much for me to do." "I understand. No one understands better than I." One corner of his mouth came upward, but the crooked smile held little actual mirth. "I became a duke all at once. The responsibilities that come with our titles are innumerable. But you needn't attempt to fulfill them all at once. The season is nearly over. Parliament adjourns in 2 days. Rest. You have all summer to learn at my mother's side." Her shoulders nearly drooped, defeat inevitable. But Cecilia shook that feeling away. "It is a ball. I can manage a ball, Gregory." "Not this time," he said, a note of finality in his words, a touch of command in his sudden frown. "It is too much, happening too quickly. Trust me, Cecilia. Rest." She lifted her chin but had nothing more to say. The Duke had issued a command. As his wife, she had no choice but to accept his decision, especially if the Dowager Duchess agreed. "The ball is tomorrow evening," she reminded him, a touch of defiance in her tone. "Hopefully 2 whole days is enough time to make me appear suitable, even if you think me incapable of being your Duchess. Good day, Your Grace." She swept away, and when he did not call her back, cold disappointment flooded her heart and into her veins. The Duke, her husband, had decided she wasn't yet fit to fill the role of Duchess, all because he found her sleeping upon a desk. Cecilia wanted to scream, or kick something. As a Duchess, both actions were beneath her. True, she hadn't slept well in weeks, but that was to be expected given the upheaval in her life. An earl's daughter and a duke's wife had vastly different responsibilities, and she had been managing to learn hers quite well. She knew the household staff, schedule, and budget. She had written several letters, both accepting and politely rejecting invitations. She had reorganized the household menu, begun redecorating the library, taken tea with many important ladies, too, to cement her place in society. What did it matter that she hadn't had an appetite of late? Skipping a few breakfasts and foregoing a course or two at dinner meant nothing. Her steps slowed as she passed a mirror in the corridor, and then took 3 steps backward to stand before it. She peered into the glass, looking for the signs her husband and mother-in-law claimed to have seen. Yes, there were dark circles beneath her eyes. A little powder would fix those. Perhaps she appeared a little paler than strictly fashionable, but rouge would fix that. Cosmetics would solve all her problems. Her shoulders fell. She continued her course to her rooms, but not to dress for a walk, because the very idea of pacing back and forth in the sunlight made her weary. Perhaps Gregory had a point. But did he have to be so high and mighty when he drove it home? And why couldn't he have spoken with her first, before issuing his commands to all and sundry? Cecilia rang for tea when she returned to her bedroom. She settled into her favourite chair near the fire, and wondered, quite miserably, what she ought to do now. Chapter 7. The night of her bridal ball arrived, and Cecilia sat before her dressing table frowning into her mirror. Her maid had already arranged her hair into artful twists and clever curls, then powdered the whole of it. Cecilia stared at her pale locks and her equally pale face. She had not thought to miss the ability to wear her hair in its natural colour, but her place in society as a duke's wife meant showing their wealth in every possible way, including hair powder. Rumour was that William Pitt wanted to pass a tax on hair powder. If he did, she might take a page from the American colonists and protest by dumping all her own hair powder in the Thames, if her husband permitted such a thing. As she stood, Her silk gown sighed against the fabric of the chair. She touched the embroidered bodice, tracing the gold-threaded ivy from one shoulder to the other. She had never worn anything so beautiful in her life. Would Gregory like it? Casting a glance at the door connecting their apartments, she wondered if she would see him before their guests arrived. Gregory had spent the last several evenings at his club finalising arguments and cementing agreements for whatever bills might pass in the last hours of Parliament's session. He hadn't been home for dinner, and he hadn't sought her out either. When he came home, whatever the hour, he slept in his own rooms. Their ridiculous argument in the courtyard marked the last time she had seen her husband. Perhaps because of that very argument he kept away, but whether he meant to give her time to compose herself and rest, or he wanted to punish her, she knew not. "Bring me my box of earrings, please," she said to her maid. The servant lowered her eyes and curtsied, but did not move to retrieve the jewellery box from inside the dressing-room. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I was bid to tell you that His Grace has your jewels for the evening." "Oh." Cecilia considered this a moment. "I suppose I had better retrieve them. Thank you, Sprat. That is all for now." She waited until the servant left the room before going to the door that joined her room to her husband's. She stood before it uncertain. Ought she to knock? She had never breached the doorway before. Always the Duke came to her. A knock came from the other side, startling Cecilia enough that she gasped, then pulled the door open without saying a word, which in turn made Gregory appear startled on his side of the divide. They stared at one another in silent surprise. Gregory caught hold of himself first. "Good evening, Cecilia." "Gregory?" She lowered her gaze only to catch sight of the box he held. "I am told you have my jewellery for the evening." Perhaps her words sounded more accusatory than she meant. She tried to soften them with a smile. "Yes, I hope it didn't inconvenience you to wait for them. May I come in?" He had never asked permission before. It wasn't necessary for a husband to do so, and something about him making the request now melted some of her earlier frustration. She gestured for him to step inside, then preceded him to her dressing table. She sat in the chair and made eye contact with him through the mirror. "I had these commissioned for you," he said, putting the box down in front of her, "when you agreed to be my wife. It took longer for the jeweller to get the pieces right than he expected, but I hope you like them." Curious, she unlatched the box in front of her. Heat climbed into her cheeks. What would a duke commission for a duchess? She had seen the Queen's jewels, and her mother-in-law possessed stunning pieces that were hundreds of years old, and looked as though they easily weighed 100 pounds when she wore them. She held her breath as she lifted the lid, revealing a bed of deep green velvet inside the box. Resting upon the rich cloth, sparkling like far-off stars brought near, were a pair of pink-tinted diamond earrings with a glittering pendant necklace as a companion piece. Staring in wonder at the beautiful, understated pieces, Cecilia could not find words. She had not thought herself a woman charmed by baubles, but this was different. "I hope you are not disappointed. The jeweller suggested traditional diamonds, but they seemed too cold, like ice." He took the necklace from the box and unclasped the chain. Then he carefully settled it around her throat, letting the drop-shaped pendant settle just beneath her collarbone. "From the moment we first met, you struck me as a woman uniquely warm, alive and present in the moment, honest to a fault, precisely the sort of woman I needed in my life." His fingers brushed the nape of her neck, then he stepped away. "Does it suit you, Cecilia?" Her eyes burned, and she had to blink rapidly to keep back tears. His thoughtfulness humbled her. Startled as she was by the emotion, she did not give way to it. She swallowed and lifted the first earring. "Let me put the earrings on, then you must be the judge of that." After affixing the second earring, she looked at his reflection in the glass. The admiration in his gaze, unconcealed as it was, made her blush. "What do you think?" "I think I chose wisely, and I am grateful for it." The weight to his words made her question whether he spoke of the jewellery or of her. Keeping away from his beautiful wife, trying to let her rest, had been difficult for Gregory, especially when their last interaction had ended in her displeasure. The last thing he wanted was to leave the quiet confines of their chambers for dinner and a ball. He looked forward to her company. Standing next to her that night, greeting their guests, filled him with an inordinate amount of pride. Yes, his wife held herself regally. Yes, she was beautiful. Above even that, she was intelligent and kind. She spoke to each person who approached them as though she knew them personally. She paid sincere compliments to the wives and daughters presented to her. When the Duke of York arrived, escorting a woman rumoured to be his latest conquest, he flirted unabashedly with Cecilia for several minutes, holding up the reception line as princes were wont to do. And for those minutes, as the prince flooded the young Duchess with pretty words, Gregory experienced a rising sense of unease. Only when Prince Frederick walked away did Cecilia lean close enough to whisper, "I can see why women think him charming, but really, flirting with a married woman, a mistress on his arm, all while he has a wife of his own. Not at all attractive behaviour." They had to greet another pair of guests before Gregory could respond, trying to keep his tone thoughtful. He is a powerful man. Power isn't attractive on its own. When it's wielded by someone without principle, I find it repugnant. She met his gaze, her expression open and honest. "You are powerful in your own right, husband. Please, promise me I will never find reason to regret the influence you hold." Why did his heart warm as he murmured, "I promise. And you must be the one to call this conversation to mind should I ever waver." More members of the nobility had extramarital affairs than not, so he did not take his promise lightly. Her cheeks pinked, and then their conversation was taken up by still more guests. Dinner went on for far too long, with the Duchess seated too far from the Duke for his liking. Why had his mother insisted on so many guests before the ball even began? When at last Cecilia stood from the table, he had to fight back a sigh of relief. He meant to go to her as soon as politeness allowed. The ball would carry on late into the night, practically until dawn, and guests must be managed. Cecilia always seemed to stand on the opposite side of the room from Gregory. While that meant he could watch her with one eye, it also made conversations difficult to follow. Gregory wanted to stand with his wife. He wanted to be the one who made her laugh, who introduced her to the guests. Most of all, he wanted to drink in every word she said. Beautiful, intelligent Cecilia, Duchess of Montfort, sparkled brighter than the diamonds he had gifted her. He missed her. Terribly. And the realization had set him back while he was contemplating gifting her the diamonds. It was almost a physical ache to be without her. Though they hadn't been married long, he longed for her company. The days and nights felt incomplete without her. He looked forward to the hours spent in conversation with her. Never had she acted in awe of him, his title, or the trappings that came with it. Cecilia treated him with the same respect and kindness as she did everyone. The attraction he felt toward her had initially been instinctual. He sensed they would get along, and that she would fill the role of Duchess well. In time. He certainly hadn't expected her to devote herself to the role with such zeal that she lost sleep over it. But that attraction had shifted and grown deeper with each passing day. He'd been pleased by the practical match. A duke could hope for little more than that. But now there was a distinct possibility that what he felt went beyond mere satisfaction and affection. He had always dismissed the possibility of love as something only lesser men were entitled to seek. Kings, princes, and dukes had too much to lose to allow for love in marriage. But watching his wife across the room, his whole heart pushing him to join her, made him question everything he knew about their relationship. "How does married life suit you, Montfort?" The Earl of Annesbury was one of the few men in England able to speak so casually to Gregory. The older man had helped Gregory find his footing after the death of his father. The Earl had no need to powder his hair. It had turned white ages ago. Something Gregory almost envied. He found her again in the crowd, watching Cecilia carry herself with regal grace. "I find I enjoy it, but like all worthwhile pursuits, I need to spend a great deal more time practicing at it." The Earl chuckled. "Wait until the children come. My oldest boy is doing his best to get thrown out of school." He looked oddly proud of that fact, then gestured across the ballroom. "This is your bridal ball, Montfort. You ought to at least be seen with your bride. maybe even scandalized the whole room by dancing with her. Needing no further convincing, Gregory bowed and parted from his friend. He made for his wife without hesitation, and those in his way swiftly stepped out of it. As though she sensed his approach, Cecilia turned away from the knot of people she conversed with when he was mere steps away. Her eyes brightened upon seeing him, and he bowed with his hand extended to her. "I think it time for us to dance, my Duchess." Her lips pressed together, but did not entirely conceal her smile before she answered him. "I thought you would never ask, dear Duke." As he escorted her to lead the rows of dancers, Gregory felt the weight of the crowd's eyes upon them. The ballroom, filled to bursting with the most important men and women in England, had grown warm almost to the point of discomfort. Yet the moment he stood across from his wife, preparing to dance a minuet with her, everything else fell away. Duke and Duchess faced one another. Gregory and Cecilia, a husband and a wife, met in their first dance. The steps were light, the music buoyant, and they moved through the twists and turns of the dance with practiced ease, almost as though they had danced together their whole lives. His wife displayed an entirely appropriate smile to any who watched, the barest upward tilt of her lips, but her eyes sparkled at him brighter than the gems she wore. Gregory counted himself fortunate to have her each time their hands touched. When the music faded away, leaving them facing one another, he bowed more deeply than the dance called for, and he heard murmurs around him. He escorted his wife away from the other dancers, wishing deeply that they were alone. Yet the ebb and flow of conversation and dancing that evening soon separated them again, and Gregory counted the minutes until everyone else would be gone. When the blessed time came at last, with Gregory and Cecilia personally seeing off the Duke of York and his party, they walked in silence together down the long halls. He was besotted by his wife. His heart warned him that he might feel for her more deeply than he had supposed possible. "I am utterly spent," Gregory said, sliding his gaze to his wife. She leaned heavily on his arm and covered yet another yawn with her gloved hand. "As am I." Why did he feel nervous? Something had changed between them. He felt it even if she did not. But she had to, didn't she? Cecilia had looked at him as they danced in such a way that he thought she saw into his soul. "I haven't forgiven you yet," she said, and he stopped walking immediately, pulling her to a stop too. "Forgiven me? For what?" He stared, wondering if her exhaustion made her misremember something. "I wasn't aware I was in your black books, wife." "You are, husband." She turned so she could look up into his eyes, her own shining beautifully up at him. But he could see the dark circles appearing beneath them. His young wife's fatigue tugged at his heart. "You need to rest. We can discuss this later." She abruptly released his arm. "You see? This is what I haven't forgiven you for. You cannot decide that I need rest." She snapped, then turned and walked away from him, muttering as she went. "Commanding me to give up on planning the ball, ignoring me for days, and still bundling me off to bed like an invalid." He followed after her, confusion and the need for sleep making his head buzz. "Cecilia, everyone needs to sleep after staying awake dancing until dawn. It isn't a remark upon your abilities to suggest such a thing." "You remain ignorant of my meaning, Your Grace," she said over her shoulder, turning the corner. "You sent me away like an irritable infant in need of a nap, then stayed away until I learned my lesson." "That isn't what I meant to do," he returned, and she stopped with her hand on the door to her chambers. "I had no wish to disturb your rest. Anyone could see that you had overtaxed yourself." "I wasn't born to the role of Duchess. If I am to be a good wife to you, I must work hard at learning how to become one." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and she did not turn to look at him. "Taking the decision to rest, of how I ought to rest, away from me was uncalled for and needlessly high-handed of you." That was how she saw him. High-handed. Taking things from her. Gregory winced at the unflattering picture. Yet she must know he only did what he had because he worried for her. Cared for her. "You were not listening to reason. Reason wasn't presented. Your decision was." She pushed open her door. "I am tired, Gregory. Since you seem to think the best way to handle a tired wife is to avoid her, I will say good night. I do not expect to see you again today, as I am sure I will need the whole of it to recover." She stepped into her room and closed the door with a snap. He stood alone in the hall, wondering what he'd done wrong this time. He had felt closer to understanding Cecilia, so close to strengthening his marital bonds with her over the triumph of the evening. Never mind the way his heart had lifted with hope every time their eyes met across the crowded room. This would never do. He went to his own bed, puzzling over how to please his wife. Aside from that evening, as she had spoken to guests and enjoyed the spectacle presented in her honour, when had he seen her happiest? Conjuring up the memory took longer than he liked. They had spoken little. Yet there was the day in the library when she had appeared cheerful about rearranging furniture. He wrinkled his nose and rolled over in bed. Furniture could not be the way to his wife's heart. Her heart. Was that really what mattered to him? What he sought to obtain? Romance in marriage had grown in popularity, at least when it came to novels and theatricals. Gregory had never given such sentiment such thought, not when he knew his must be a practical match. The idea of loving his wife burrowed further into his mind, and his heart welcomed the concept with a warmth he recognized as affection. Could he love Cecilia? Not merely admire her, or be fond of her company, but truly love her, devoting himself to her above all things. A duke did not normally have such a luxury as love in marriage. He could not hope for it or depend upon it. But what if he found it by accident? He adored her quick wit. Her beauty attracted him. When he came upon her in the library that day the window had stuck, putting his arms around her to help her had given him such a heady feeling of rightness. That was the last time they had spoken with ease, when she had asked about the furniture and then the castle. His breath hitched. Cecilia had wanted to see Clairvoir Castle. She'd been excited rather than horrified at the idea of an ancient hall under construction. She'd seemed eager, even recognizing the name of the architect who had helped his father design the initial plans. All the way up until the moment he'd informed her he had no wish to visit the castle after the catastrophic fire. At the time, he'd wondered at her interest. The night's events took their toll on him, but Gregory made himself a promise before he fell asleep. He would go to his father-in-law and inquire after Cecilia's interest in architecture. Then he would plan how best to woo his wife. Chapter 8. Parliament had closed for the annual summer recess, and Cecilia had every expectation of seeing her husband more often. A thing which had given her a thrill of cheerful anticipation, until her mother-in-law had taken pains to remind Cecilia that a Duke and Duchess had much to do, even as the principal figures of society and politics fled London for the cooler climes of country air and the seaside. "This is how it is done, my dear," the Dowager said the morning after Parliament's adjournment, clearly oblivious to Cecilia's sudden shift in mood. "There will be hunts for your husband, house parties, and visits to the ducal properties. There is the house in Bath, the house in Ireland, the lodge in Northumberland, not to mention the properties in France we must rescue before this business with their revolutionaries devolves into chaos." "It sounds as though we will be busier than before," Cecilia summed up, "merely in diverse places." "Exactly." Her mother-in-law put a hand to her temple. "Oh, this tea is doing nothing for the headache. Cecilia, dear, I am afraid I must excuse myself from our work this morning. Perhaps a nap will set me to rights." "Oh." The news ought not give her such a sense of relief without at least a little guilt. "Would you like me to send for the doctor, Mother?" "No, not for such a silly thing as a headache. I will not be one of those invalids in Bath carried about from one place to another, sending for a doctor at every sign of an ailment." The Dowager stood to her full height, as regal-looking and beautiful as any woman Cecilia knew. "Take time for yourself this morning. I will send word later if there is any improvement." "Of course. I hope you feel better after your nap." Cecilia walked in the opposite direction of her mother-in-law when they left the sitting-room. As she strolled idly through the long corridors of Dinard House, she tried to tuck away her disappointment. Marrying a duke, she knew her husband would be a man with many claims on his time. Yet she had missed her husband every day she had not seen him. When they had time in one another's company, it was never enough. Her wandering path took her through the public rooms of the house. She walked between Greek statues and beneath a Roman-inspired arch, along a gallery of Italian and Dutch painters, and then back into the wide corridors of rooms less used for entertaining. The wealth and history displayed on every wall still awed her. That all this belonged to her new family, and she was now a guardian to these precious relics of time. She opened the doors to the library and walked to the side where a map stretched between two tall bookcases. And then she sat upon one of the couches she had moved from a lesser-used parlour to the library. A much more comfortable couch than what had been there before. Cecilia looked up at the map of the world, created in the century before, and followed the lines of continents with her eyes, trying not to think of anything, basking in the silence. She had left the door to the library open, and the footman that followed her everywhere in the corridor outside. Thomas Merrill was always within calling distance, something she appreciated, even if she did not think his watchfulness strictly necessary when she was perfectly safe at home. Come, when she would be grateful for the dual purpose of the footman. A familiar voice drifted through the corridor, making her sit up straighter. "Merrill, is the Duchess in the library?" "Yes, Your Grace." She hastily stood and smoothed her hair back from her face, then clasped her hands before her in as relaxed a posture as possible. "Excellent." Gregory came into the room, his stride long and his expression animated. "Cecilia, I've been looking everywhere for you." He came directly to her, hands outstretched, preventing her from offering any formal kind of greeting. "I was with your mother, but she had to retire for a nap." She looked up into his handsome face and saw his eyes fairly sparkling with excitement. "Has something happened? You seem different." He grinned at her, then raised her bare hand to his lips to rest a kiss upon her knuckles. "I am a free man today, my dear, and I have come to ask you to join me in my escape." A nervous laugh escaped her. "I do not have any idea what you're talking about, husband." He tugged her back down to the couch, sitting alongside her. "I have finalised plans with my steward here in London, and he has sent along my requests to Lambsthorpe to lease a house there for a month this summer." "Lambsthorpe?" She sorted through what she knew of English geography and still could not think of where such a place might lay on a map. "I do not understand." He didn't seem disappointed by her lack of knowledge. His grin widened. "It's the village that is nearest Clairvoir Castle." Cecilia's heart sped up and she held her husband's hands tighter in her own. "Clairvoir Castle? But you said we would not visit this summer. There is so much more you need to do." "What could be more important than introducing my Duchess to our ancestral home? Conferred on the first member of my family by William the Conqueror. You want to see it, do you not?" "Yes, of course. But the damage from the fire is still there. After you see it, I hope you might advise me on what you think might be salvaged. My father's friend Reverend Gooch lives nearby. He has all the building plans my father commissioned. He also created a model of what the castle looked like before." Eagerly, Cecilia nodded along with every word her husband said. Then when he stopped, the practical part of her mind made her shake it instead. "But Gregory, you said there was so much work to be done for the castle, and your mother gave me a schedule for this summer and autumn." "Dash the schedule." Her jaw dropped, and when he appeared mischievous rather than repentant for his language, she giggled. "Do not let your mother hear you say that." "I mean it, Cecilia." He faced her fully and drew her hands to his chest, laying them palm down over his heart. She felt heat rush into her cheeks, and she could not tear her gaze from his as he reassured her. "We will take a month. You must see Clairvoir Castle and the Vale. I want to know what you make of it, if you think we can save any of the old fortress. It is an immense undertaking, one that I have not had the heart to pursue. But I have learned that you, my most excellent Duchess, are a student of architecture." "Who told you that?" she asked, whispering, though she knew not why. Except perhaps that she felt something changing. A shift in their relationship had happened, though when and how she could not be certain. "Your father." Gregory sobered for a moment. He seemed put out that I had yet to learn about your passion for Ionic columns. Or was it Doric? "Greek Ionic, though I enjoy a Roman Doric on occasion too." She slid her hands from his chest to around his shoulders. "You really want me to look the castle over? I am a novice at such things." "You are the Duchess of Montfort, the ruler of Castle Clairvoir and the keeper of our family honour and legacy. Who better to help me make decisions for the future than you?" He bent closer, and Cecilia tipped her chin up to meet his lips with hers. They had kissed before, of course, and more after entering their mutually beneficial marriage. But this kiss was different. It was somehow more. Because within this kiss, Cecilia felt her husband make a promise. Her heart tentatively opened to him, hopeful of what was yet to come. Hopeful that their practical arrangement, something she had found perfectly acceptable before, would become something more. Chapter 9. The closer the carriage came to Lambsthorpe, the more agitated Gregory became. The last time he had seen the castle, soot blackened entire walls. The roof had collapsed in one wing. And his wife, his lovely Cecilia, was about to see just how daunting a task it would be to restore the castle to any of its former glory. "Are you certain you do not wish to go to our house first?" he asked for the third time. "We have been in the carriage 4 hours this morning. You could rest. We can visit the castle tomorrow." She covered his hand, resting between them on the bench with her own. "Gregory, we are so close, and there are hours of daylight left. Let me see it now, or I promise I will not rest this evening." His wife's eyes glowed with anticipation. It had taken 2 weeks to settle everything for their trip. They had sent word ahead to their leased house and to the skeleton staff of the castle to make certain all was prepared. Gregory's secretary had undertaken the task of rearranging all their social engagements, relieving Gregory of as many responsibilities as possible, so he could concentrate on winning Cecilia's heart. What if she hated the castle? Or if it discouraged her when she beheld it in its current state? "Gregory?" He blinked and turned away from the window to see her smiling from beneath her bonnet. "Stop worrying so." She squeezed his hand, then leaned her cheek upon his shoulder. The road tilted upward as they began down the wide, circling path up the hill. To distract himself from the unpleasant knot of worry in his stomach, Gregory began reciting the castle's history aloud. The first building that stood there was little more than a watchtower made of wood. There is an old map in the family archives with a picture, the date on its side from the 13th century. His wife made a small sound of interest, so he continued. "Then it was rebuilt into stone when my first ancestor was stylized as the Earl of Montfort. There's a tapestry at Woodgrove Hall in Nottinghamshire that shows the detail of what it looked like then." He looked out at the trees, their leaves lush and green, creating a tunnel over the road and obscuring the top of the hill and the castle from sight. Cecilia took up the narrative. "Then Cromwell's government took over in the 17th century, and the Royalists claimed the castle while the Earl was away. A battle took place, destroying the castle." She shook her head almost miserably. "I wonder how much history was lost." His wife had a tender place in her heart for history, something he found he quite liked about her. "It was that Earl's wife who took it upon herself to rebuild," he said quietly, "a several times great-grandmother of mine. It seems fitting that a Duchess take upon herself what a Countess once did. Obviously, this castle requires a woman's capabilities to see it righted." She beamed up at him. "And then the 9th Earl of Montfort became the 1st Duke of Montfort. And I am the 5th. He swallowed as the carriage brightened, coming out from beneath the trees and rumbling on a gravel track that likely needed raking and a fresh surface of stones. He closed his eyes and hoped his castle did not look as poorly as he remembered. The carriage came to a stop beside the southwestern entrance, and the groomsman opened the door. Gregory stepped out first, then held his hand out to his wife. As Cecilia stepped down, her smile at him pulled an answering grimace, and then her eyes drifted upward, and her lips parted. She released his hand as soon as her feet touched the ground, and she walked forward, not up to the doors, but to the walls. Gregory watched as his wife approached one stone wall, the colour a shade of yellow gold he had no better name for, and laid her gloved hand against it. For a long moment she simply stood there, head tipped forward as though in prayer, and then she lifted her chin upward and turned back to him with an enormous grin in place. "I have made my promises to her to see her restored. Now come, we have a lot to see before we lose the light." They met the servants first, and then the groundskeeper walked with them around the stone castle. Half the outer walls were completely untouched by fire. Most were still intact, even if the fire had destroyed the rooms within. The courtyard was in a similar state. But when they walked through the fire-blighted rooms, which was fully 3/4 of the interior, Gregory's heart fell. It was far worse than he remembered. Cecilia grew quiet, a pensive look upon her face, the skin around her eyes pinched and her jaw tight. They thanked the groundskeeper after 2 hours of walking and looking in on the damaged rooms. Gregory kept his wife's hand tucked in his arm as they made their way back to the carriage. He couldn't find words to comfort her. There was so much to be repaired, still more that had to be done to update the 200-year-old castle. It was too much to thrust on a woman of her age and inexperience. Already the duties of a duchess had drained her to the point of exhaustion. "I don't know what I was thinking," he said aloud, stopping at a corner of the outer wall. He looked upward. Here the damage was most evident in blackened, fallen stone. "I apologize, Cecilia. This is an overwhelming task. I cannot lay it at your feet as I meant to do." "Gregory Dinard," she said, her voice quiet. "You will not take this away from me." Startled, he looked down at her, and his heart thumped with confused attraction when she glared up at him. "Cecilia, look." Her eyes narrowed and her cheeks flushed. She waved her arm at the castle beside them. "This is your legacy. A castle has stood here since the 11th century, a testament to your family's faithfulness to the people and our kingdom. Just as I would not allow it to fall into disrepair and neglect on my watch, I will not allow it to suffer in this half-burnt state. Not a day longer than necessary." Then she turned to look out over the valley. "Clairvoir Vale is beautiful, and the people deserve to have their duke and his family in residence as often as our other duties can spare us." He stared down at her, completely aghast. "Cecilia, this will take years, and empty our coffers. I may be a duke, but I do not have infinite funds. I cannot ask this of you." "You are not asking." She stared up at him, her ink-blue eyes unwavering, her lips pressed together in a solemn line. "I promised Clairvoir. Now I am promising you. I will see her repaired and renewed. I have faith in my abilities, and I have my whole life to see it done correctly. Won't you give me your faith, too? I can do it, Gregory. I know I can." She fell silent, her wide eyes pleading with him for the lifeblood of a building made of stone and mortar. The castle that had been his home as a child and guarded the happiest memories of his life. The castle that had fallen, so near his father's death, mingling his grief and mourning for both until he could not tell where one ended and the other began. "It is more than a building," she said, as though she knew his heart. "It is your history, the legacy of hundreds of lives before ours and hundreds after. Our children will call Clairvoir Castle their home, and our grandchildren, and their grandchildren." She placed one hand over her heart. "Please, Gregory, let me do this for you and for them." Her image blurred as tears filled his eyes and stopped up his throat. His chest tightened and he heaved out a breath that broke with a sob. He hadn't realized how much it hurt to know Clairvoir stood in near ruin. Not until he saw it again. Not until she promised to make it right. This delicate, beautiful woman who promised practicality yet seemed to see directly into his heart. She had promised the castle itself to heal it. Had she known by doing so she was healing him too? When one of the most powerful men in the kingdom looked ready to fall to his knees, it was up to someone who loved him to keep him standing. Cecilia wrapped her arms around her husband's waist and leaned against him, supporting him like one of her beloved columns supporting an ancient monument. His arms encircled her in return, and he buried his face in her shoulder. Had anyone ever let him cry like this before? As a duke, had he dared give vent to such emotion in front of anyone? Her tears joined his, though quieter. She felt the tremble in his strong frame, and she kept her own still and strong. Her promise was about so much more than the castle. She meant all she'd said with all her heart, and she made the same promises for the man in her arms. Gregory's life was tied to his title, his duties, his legacy. But he was a man like any other, with a heart she saw more of every time he looked at her. When he regained his hold, which did not take over long, he stood and looked down at her. His cheeks were wet, but his eyes blazed with new life, and he didn't excuse his emotion. He was unashamed, as was she. But he gently brushed away the tears on her cheeks. "The more we saw, the more I felt I had laid a curse on you with this castle," he murmured. "I am too practical for curses." Her response made him smile. "Truly, this is a gift. I have studied buildings and their histories my whole life. I promise I will make a close study of this one too. It will give me joy to give it back to you the way it's meant to be." "Better than before, I should think," he added, teasing her almost gingerly. "I can do it, I promise." "I know you can." He kissed her forehead. "I hope you will let me help." He looked toward the corner of the castle again, knowing that the carriage waited just around it. Yet he hesitated to leave. Cecilia took his arm and led him across the grass to the edge of the rise. The valley stretched out beneath them and rose again to more hills. They could see the village and houses dotting the landscape, along with a pond and flowing streams. Sheep dotted a hill in the distance. "It's beautiful," she said again. "I can see why you love it so much." His voice deepened when he said, "I hope you come to love it too." "How can I not?" Her heart trembled, as did her hands, as she considered whether to tell him her suspicions about her feelings towards him. She had promised him a practical bride, not a romantically inclined woman, not someone who hoped for his heart to turn to hers. They hadn't been married long. There were years ahead of them to grow closer or further apart. His arm slid around her waist and he pulled her gently to his side. "I am glad we came," he murmured. Cecilia laid her head upon his shoulder. This would be enough for her, for now. Chapter 10. The month at the leased house in Lambsthorpe changed everything for the better. For one thing, Gregory could find his wife in much less time than it took in their London house. A smaller, more convenient arrangement of rooms made that easier, which meant he was forever in her company, whether she was entertaining local gentlewomen or meeting with the Reverend Gooch to go over the late Duke's plans for the castle. Gregory was always there, practically at her elbow, and Cecilia, far from minding, encouraged him to stay there with her. Their time together felt more valuable, more important, as it remained just the two of them. His mother meant well, of course, but to be husband and wife, without the dowager's presence and other demands upon their time, meant they had only each other to rely upon for companionship. He quite enjoyed it. "You could write your correspondence in the morning room with me," she said during their second day in the house. "We can bring in a larger desk if the one near the window is too delicate for you." He wrote at the delicate desk and listened as she spoke to guests. He read while she played the pianoforte and the harp, and he watched her, night after night, as she spoke of her ideas for the castle across the small dinner table. And when the night came, he held her in his arms as she slept deeply, satisfied by the day's labours and his company. His heart continued to tumble, falling ever deeper into love. Then the night came that their luggage was packed, and they sat together in the parlour after dinner for the last time. "This has been a dream," Cecilia said, leaning against his chest with her legs tucked up on the couch next to her. "I know there is still so much to do before we return to London in the winter, but being here with you, just you, has been wonderful." "Despite the many times I've gotten in your way and questioned your plans?" he asked. He lifted one of her slim hands to examine how well her fingers fit laced with his. "You were right about the cellars," she reminded him, voice soft as the firelight. "I can allow for that, since I was right about everything else." He chuckled and she snuggled closer to him. "As long as we can agree that I was right about the most important thing." "Which is what?" she challenged, not moving from her place against him. And he knew, pressed against his heart as she was, that she had to hear the way it beat faster as he gathered his courage. "I was right about marrying you." She sighed, the sound contented. "I will agree. I never should have tried to talk you out of it." "I admired your honesty, though." He brushed the top of her forehead with his lips. I admire most things about you." "Thank you." She tipped her head back at last to look up at him, gifting him a gentle smile. "I feel the same about you." His heart reminded him with an urgent pressure that he had more to say, and that this was the time to say it. "I wonder if you do." Her delicate eyebrows raised, and she tipped her head to the side, silently inviting him to say more. Their lives stretched before them, years and years of politics, society, hardship, joy, hopefully the blessing of children, and more he could not guess at were all ahead. Would telling her make a difference? It had to, because letting himself ponder the truth had made him a new man. It made him feel kinder, lighter, more capable. And if she did not return his feelings? Gregory did not allow himself to think on it. The time for thought had passed. It was time for more. Cecilia. He swallowed, trying to remember the speech he had prepared over the course of many hours. Not a word of it came to him. She sat up, a little away from him, wearing a serious frown. "I am listening, Gregory." He touched her cheek, tracing the round pink curve down to her jaw. "I love you, more deeply than I ever thought possible. Yet I know that I will love you more tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after. Because every day that we are together, I cannot help but give you more of my heart." The deep blue of her eyes glistened, and she covered her mouth with one hand as she smiled tremulously. His heart lifted with hope. "I love you," he said again, kissing her forehead, "with everything I am." Then he covered her trembling lips with his, pouring out his heart in a lover's token he had taken for granted before, showing her how he treasured her, longed for her, honoured her. When they parted at last, her tears still gleamed unshed. She laughed and sounded a gentle purr. "I am so glad." She touched his cheek, cupping it gently in her hand as he turned to kiss her wrist. "I have wanted to tell you the same for weeks. I love you too." He had known the moment he confessed to her that she felt the same. Hearing the words sweetened the moment between them. He opened his arms and she slipped once more into his embrace. The room grew quiet and his heart soft. There had never been a more perfect moment. "Gregory." "Yes, my dearest love." He grinned at himself, and she chuckled at the endearment, then snuggled closer to him. "Now seems like the perfect time to tell you. We have been married 2 months now." He placed another kiss on the dark curls at her forehead. "Only 2 months? How did I exist before you came into my world?" She leaned back and narrowed her eyes at him. "I am being serious, Your Grace." "Ah, serious." He affected a more stern expression. "Yes, 2 months." She pursed her lips prettily. "Long enough for me to be relatively sure of something rather important." "In addition to your love?" "Yes, in addition to that." She drew in a deep breath, her gaze never leaving his. I'm fairly certain, that I am with child." His lungs stopped working correctly, so his words came out in a whisper. "A child? Our child?" Then he cupped her face in both hands and studied her with wonder, watching as tears glistening like stars fell from her eyes as she smiled up at him. "Yes, ours," she laughed, and he wrapped her in his arms and swore to them both to never let her go. Epilogue. May 1818. 27 years of marriage later. The terraced gardens of Castle Clairvoir were the envy of every noble with a country estate. The lavish gardens had taken 2 decades of work to get them that way. Work not everyone was willing to put in the way Cecilia, her mother-in-law, and a team of gardeners had lavished upon Clairvour's landscape. "Cecilia, love, here you are." Gregory Dinard, Duke of Montfort, called to her as he came around a rosebush. "You started our walk without me." "I did nothing of the kind," she insisted, tucking her arm through his. I was merely scouting ahead. Why is that? Do you expect us to wander into enemy territory on a ramble through the gardens? He grinned at her, a wide, warm grin that still had the ability to make her heart twist happily when he bestowed it on her. Not precisely. She brought him to the wall of the upper garden, and one of the few places where one could look down into the rest of the manicured plots of land without a tree or bush standing in the way. Mr. Gardiner is adamant he not be disturbed in his studies, and look, he is in the statuary. Gregory peered downward with her and snorted. He doesn't want our daughters disturbing him, or our youngest son. I doubt he would mind if you wandered through your own statuary. Over their years together, Cecilia had learned that her husband possessed a keen and curious mind regarding the natural world. When they had funds to spare, because restoring the castle had been an expensive undertaking, and the war with France yet another drain on their coffers, he had taken up the patronage of several scientific studies and scholars in Oxford and Cambridge. Mr. Rupert Gardiner, though much younger than the Duke, had impressed him enough to gain both patronage and friendship. Gregory had asked the gentleman to perform a scientific study of the insects and plant life of Clairvour's gardens and surrounding lands. They both watched, arm in arm, as Mr. Gardiner went from standing near a statue to lying flat on the ground, stretched out with his face practically buried in a flower bed. Cecilia stifled a giggle, placing her hand over her lips. At her age, she probably ought to have more decorum. I have heard Gardiner's valet quite bemoans his master's disregard for dirt, but one must admire his devotion to his studies. He gave his wife a crooked smile. I know someone just as fixated on her own work. Cecilia leaned against her husband, her gaze sweeping across the gardens and toward the valley. Yes, she had devoted herself to Clairvoir Castle, and what a magnificent project it had been. Without turning, she knew the castle stood proudly at her back, with turrets reminiscent of German castles reaching for the clear blue sky. New Gothic, some of her friends had called it. The castle stood like a grand queen, overlooking all of Clairvoir Vale as a benevolent monarch. Cecilia kept her promise made to the stone walls and her husband. The castle was a place of respite for her family, with halls and bedrooms enough to welcome even a royal entourage, and within its rooms it held treasure and history side by side with laughter and tears. She had built the home of her dreams, a palace worthy of a fairy tale. And Gregory had been with her. Every time she struggled to make her plans look right, every time she put aside the castle to funnel their money and influence to more pressing needs, through the births of all their children, and especially through the difficulties of losing some of the poor little souls before they had the chance to take a breath. 5 of their children lived in the castle walls with them, 2 sons, 3 daughters, and Cecilia could think of no better nest for her fledglings than the one she and Gregory had built together on a foundation that stretched back centuries. Who was that? The Duke asked, bringing her out of her thoughts and to the present moment. A young woman dressed in dark blue darted through the gardens. Her bright blonde hair was uncovered, and she hurried with abandon from one well-scaped portion of the garden to another, hardly stopping to look at anything. Cecilia's eyebrows raised. That is our new governess, Miss Alice Sharp. The Duke chuckled. She appears energetic enough to keep up with James. Their youngest son, James, was quite the handful. The boy was in and out of multiple scrapes a day. As the baby of the family, he was perhaps a bit more spoiled than the others too. Cecilia watched her newly hired governess enter the statuary. An instant before the calamity occurred, Gregory and Cecilia gasped in unison. The governess tripped over Mr. Gardiner's prone figure, entangling his legs in her skirts and falling into the dirt. His startled shout burst through the garden, and Cecilia and Gregory looked at one another with wide eyes. "We did not see that," he said, waving vaguely in the accident's direction. "Neither of us." Cecilia darted another glance down the hill. Mr. Gardiner was helping the governess to her feet. "They seem all right." "But we will terribly embarrass both if we say a word about it," Gregory reminded her. She nodded thoughtfully, watching as the gentleman and the governess spoke to one another. She wished she could hear what they were saying, as much as to know that neither was harmed, as to make certain Mr. Gardiner wouldn't berate the young woman for disturbing his studies. Gregory gently pulled at her arm, leading her away. "They will be fine, darling. Now come." Let's enjoy our gardens." Cecilia put the governess and naturalist from her mind. They would be well enough. It was time for her to enjoy Clairvoir on the arm of her husband, the Duke of Montfort. God willing, they would have many years to come, walking the paths of their land together. This has been A Duchess for the Duke, a Clairvoir Castle novella. Written by Sally Britton. Narrated by Jessica Elisa Boyd. Copyright 2022 by Sally Britton. Production copyright by Sally Britton.
Hi, I wanted to do this story for a while. I'm so glad I finally had the chance. I'm Sally Britton, and this is my YouTube exclusive author's note for the novella A Duchess for the Duke. If you've listened to the novels in the main series, you know by now that my Duke and Duchess are very special people. They are kind, compassionate, and supportive parents. They have a quiet affection for each other. They trust their children. They love their beautiful home. So where did their story begin? In real life, the Duke and Duchess who inspired these fictional characters also married quite young, because the Duke inherited his title when his father passed away, when he was really no more than a boy. The people who inspired this couple were intelligent and quite busy, and the young Duchess was in large part responsible for the reconstruction and redesign of Castle Belvoir, which inspired in turn my Castle Clairvoir. So where do fiction and reality diverge? Just about everywhere else, really. I don't know what the real Duchess was like, or how she wound up marrying her Duke, or whether or not they fell in love in the early days of their marriage. The real Duchess and Duke did enjoy traveling together to purchase decor for the castle. They had a very large family. They also loved throwing parties and were good friends of the Prince Regent. He stayed with them at their castle from time to time. But that's about all they inspired. I wouldn't dare try to write about real people. Biographical characters are far too intimidating for me. My Duchess, Cecilia, young and clever, is also practical and has a stubborn bend to her that softens over the years. It was a lot of fun to write about her as a newlywed before time and experience lets her relax a little more. My hope is that in knowing this side of her, you'll see where some of her children get their stubborn streak. Josephine certainly takes after her mother and wishing to pursue her dreams, even if they aren't the most conventional thing for a woman to do. And our Duke, Gregory, is an honorable man who believes in following his instincts. He doesn't question his gut feeling that Cecilia would be a good Duchess. He acts. And I think his youngest son takes after him a great deal. I also tried to show some of the Duke's uncertainty, which you glimpse in his eldest son Simon in the book Lord Farley and Miss Frost. I have heard from more than one reader that people are seriously crushing on the Duke. He isn't like other Dukes in Regency fiction, mostly because he is already happily married in the main novels and more concerned with what is right than what makes him look good. I'm not certain how realistic a depiction that is, but there have always been good people in different levels of society throughout history and throughout the world. My gentle, light-hearted, low-angst Clairvoir Castle series exists because of the Duke and Duchess. Even though they aren't main characters in the other stories, their kindness and devotion to their family and their nation is what makes it possible for love stories to unfold as they do on the castle grounds. I hope you enjoyed coming to know these characters better, and that this glimpse into the Duke and Duchess's love story and the founding of their family will make the other love stories even more enjoyable. Thank you for visiting the castle. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the little bell so you won't miss the next upload. Until next time, I'm Sally Britton, and this has been my YouTube exclusive author's note for the novella A Duchess for the Duke.